Hey everyone, nearly 95% of people who watch my videos haven't subscribed yet. If you're enjoying the content, I'd really appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It means a lot. Also, be sure to give a video a like and drop a comment below. Your interaction helps more people discover the channel and supports its growth. Thanks a ton for being here. By the way, I'd love to know which country or city are you watching from? I never really thought much about Iowa before that trip. It was supposed to be a simple camping getaway with a few friends, nothing fancy, just tents, a fire, and some time away from the city. I had imagined wide fields, quiet nights, and a sense of peace I could never find back home. We arrived in the late afternoon, the kind of golden sunlight that casts long shadows over the flatland, the way it does in the Midwest. The campsite we picked was small but adequate, with space for 3 tents and a fire ring. The other spots around us were mostly empty, which was exactly what we wanted. We set up our tents, unpacked coolers, and built a fire. Everything seemed normal, serene even, until night fell and the darkness settled like a heavy blanket over the campsite. It was around 2 in the morning when it started. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer caught in a trap, or a fox screaming somewhere in the woods. But the sound didn't match anything I knew from the surrounding area. It was high-pitched, full of terror, and it carried across the air with a clarity that made my stomach turn. Blood-curdling screams. Not the kind of sound that makes you jump because of a sudden scare, but the kind that roots you to the spot because it's pure, raw suffering. My friends stirred in their tents, groggy and half asleep, but I didn't wait for anyone. Something inside me told me I had to see what was happening. I grabbed my flashlight, the kind that barely cuts through the darkness, and ran toward the source of the screams. As I approached, I could make out shadows moving around a fire. The smell hit me first. Alcohol mixed with smoke and something metallic that I couldn't place at first. It was strong and sharp, like blood, and it made my stomach twist. The closer I got, the more I realized these weren't wild animals. There were people, a lot of them, way more than the campsite could hold. They were sprawled around tents and fire pits, some sitting, some standing, some lying on the ground. But the screams were coming from one person, a girl, and she looked absolutely destroyed. She was crouched on the ground, shaking, retching, and heaving over and over again, but there was nothing left to throw up. Her eyes were wide, glassy, and panicked. I realized immediately that she was having a bad reaction, probably an overdose or a really bad trip. Her skin was pale, almost gray in the flashlight's beam, and she was drenched in sweat. My first instinct was to step forward and help, to try to calm her or at least get her out of there. I asked the people around her if they needed help, expecting at least one person to step up. But their faces twisted in annoyance, not concern. They didn't even look like they recognized the gravity of the situation. They called her a nuisance, said she was ruining their fun. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. A group of 30-plus people, packed into a campsite way over the legal limit, was just standing there letting this girl suffer. I couldn't just stand there. My heart was racing, my hand was shaking, but I knew I had to do something. I yelled at them, called them out for being irresponsible, for not caring if she lived or died. Most of them just shrugged or muttered something I couldn't make out. Some started moving toward the trees, like they were going to run and hide. My mind was spinning. How could anyone be so callous, so cold? This girl could have died, and they didn't give a single thought to it. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, giving them all the details I could, the girl's condition, the number of people, the location. I stayed with her, shining my flashlight in her face, trying to keep her conscious, talking to her softly, telling her to keep breathing, to hold on. Every second felt like an eternity. While I waited, the chaos around me continued. People were stumbling around, some shouting at each other, some trying to hide bottles or drugs. The scene was like a nightmare frozen in time, a mix of lawlessness and danger. The girl's retching slowed, her breathing was shallow, and I could see her fading. I pressed my hands lightly to her back to help her upright, to keep her from collapsing completely. Sweat ran down my face, my hands were trembling, but I couldn't let fear stop me. I couldn't let her die while those people did nothing. Eventually, The sound of sirens cut through the night. Blue and red lights illuminated the trees and the campsite, harsh and blinding. The police moved quickly, separating the group, checking IDs, and securing the scene. The EMTs rushed in, working methodically to assess her condition. I stepped back, letting them do their job, but my eyes didn't leave her. They loaded her onto a stretcher, carefully and efficiently, and I watched until she was driven away. Only then did I allow myself to breathe, a slow, deep inhale that felt like it had been missing for hours. The rest of the night was a blur. The officers questioned me, took my statement, and eventually they rounded up the rest of the group. I learned later that some of them were arrested, others fined, and a few were taken to detox or treatment centers. I couldn't imagine leaving someone to die like that. It wasn't just the drugs or the overdose. It was the utter disregard for human life. That night stayed with me. Every time I close my eyes, I see that girl, crouched on the ground, gasping for air, while a group of adults argued about who had to clean up the mess. In the weeks that followed, I kept thinking about how fragile life can be and how quickly it can slip away when people don't care. I never saw that girl again, but I hope she recovered fully. I hope she realized that not everyone will leave you to die. And for me, the experience changed how I view the world. It made me hyper-aware of the dangers that people can create for each other, the cruelty that can hide behind laughter and partying, and the importance of stepping in when someone needs help, even if nobody else will. I still go camping, but I pick my spots carefully now. Iowa isn't the first place that comes to mind, and I warn anyone I can about the risks of overcrowded, poorly supervised campsites. That night taught me that danger doesn't always come from nature, and sometimes the scariest things you can face aren't wild animals or storms. They're the people around you, and their willingness to let someone else suffer. Even now, 7 years later, I remember the smell of the smoke and the sweat, the way her eyes looked as she fought to stay conscious, and the cold, hard reality that I couldn't rely on anyone else to do the right thing. But I also remember the EMTs, the police, the sense of relief when she was finally safe. I carried that with me too. It was a reminder that even in the worst human-made chaos, there are people who will step up. That night, I realized that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about acting when fear is screaming in your face, and knowing that what you do can make the difference between life and death. It left me with a clearer understanding of responsibility and human fragility, a story I carry with me in every wilderness trip I take, a warning and a lesson wrapped into one. I can still feel the tension in my muscles, the adrenaline pumping through me, the overwhelming sense of helplessness, and the satisfaction of knowing I did what I could. That girl's life mattered, and I had been in the right place at the right time to make sure it wasn't wasted. Even after all these years, that night in Iowa reminds me that sometimes the only safety net someone has is a stranger who refuses to look away. I was 13 when I went on that school camping trip in South Africa, and I can still remember that night near the river as vividly as if it happened yesterday. The trip itself was supposed to be adventurous, but safe, hiking through trails, setting up camp at different locations, sleeping a couple of nights in cabins, and the other nights in tents. The tents weren't like the ones you see in the movies. They were open-sided, basically just a canopy with some canvas to shield us from rain. For our group, which had around 40 to 50 boys, we managed to fit a third of us into each tent. Even at 13, I remember thinking that it felt cramped, but that was the least of my worries that night. That evening, we set up camp near a river. The water ran shallow there, barely knee-deep, but it was clear and moving fast enough to make the air smell fresh and cool. The sun had already started to dip below the horizon when we finished pitching the tents and gathering wood for a fire. The smell of dry grass and smoke mixed in the air, and there was this sense of calm that always comes with the end of a long day outdoors. We'd been hiking all day, carrying our packs, and by the time we were settled, most of us were exhausted. We were looking forward to a quiet night of sleep after the day's exertion, but that peace didn't last. As the darkness thickened, we started hearing it. At first, I thought it was a bird or some other animal from the surrounding woods. but then the sound became unmistakable. It was a hyena. That laugh, high-pitched, eerie, like a mix of a bark and a cackle, echoed through the night. One laugh, then another, and another, always at a distance, always surrounding us without ever coming into view. I remember my stomach sinking. Our teachers told us not to worry, that the national park was well fenced and that the hyenas were probably miles away. But anyone who has heard a hyena's laugh in the wild knows that sound travels. Even miles away, it can feel like the animals are right on top of you. The teachers try to make us feel secure. They built the fire bigger, stacking logs carefully so that the flames would reach higher, crackle louder, and light up more of the darkness around us. The fire's glow barely touched the edge of the trees, and beyond it, the shadows seemed to move with the wind. I remember watching the fire, feeling hypnotized by it, trying to convince myself that the fence was enough to keep us safe. But even with the fire and the teacher's reassurances, the noises continued. At times, it seemed like the hyenas were circling us, their distant laughter coming from all directions at once. It made the night feel claustrophobic, as if the forest itself had closed in on our little camp. We tried to sleep, or at least rest. Some of the boys whispered among themselves, but mostly there was just the crackling of the fire, the rustling of leaves, and the hyena calls echoing in the distance. No one really slept. Every snap of a twig, every gust of wind through the branches made us jump. I remember lying on the thin foam mat the school had provided, staring at the shadows of my tent flapping against the ground, imagining what would happen if the fence wasn't enough, if somehow a pack of hyenas did get in. My heart pounded in my chest, and even my own breathing sounded loud and intrusive in the tense silence. The night went on slowly. Hours passed, and the laughter of the hyenas would fade and then return, closer or farther away, as if they were teasing us. I tried to focus on something else, anything else, the smell of the fire, the warmth from my jacket, but it was impossible to ignore that feeling of vulnerability. Without solid walls, without even a real barrier between us and the wild, every shadow seemed alive. I kept my eyes on the fire and listened, counting the minutes between laughs, trying to convince myself that it was all far away and harmless. My mind went over everything we had learned about wildlife safety during the trip orientation, about staying calm and making noise to keep predators away, but knowledge didn't erase fear. I could feel my muscles tensing, ready to spring into action if anything happened. I wasn't even sure what action would help, but I knew instinctively that I wouldn't want to be caught unaware. Morning couldn't come fast enough. Dawn finally arrived with a pale light that slowly pushed away the night. The hyena calls had stopped, or at least receded far enough that the tension in the air eased slightly. I remember standing by the river with some of the other boys, the cold water lapping at our ankles, washing away the sweat and fear from the night. It felt like a relief, a slow exhale after holding my breath for hours. The river was shallow, clear, and cool, and the sunlight reflecting on the water made everything look almost peaceful, like the night had been a nightmare we had all survived. A few of the kids, along with the teacher, wandered downstream, maybe 300 feet or so, to explore. That was when they stumbled upon something that brought the reality of the previous night crashing back. A fresh carcass, torn apart, barely recognizable. The sight was horrifying. It was proof that the animals we had feared weren't just a distant sound. They were capable, opportunistic, and dangerous. The teacher made sure we all saw it from a safe distance, not to scare us more, but to give context to what had happened and reinforce why our vigilance was necessary. That night could have ended very differently if we'd been anywhere else, without the park's fence or the teacher's supervision. Seeing the carcass made the fire, the tension, and the fear of the previous night feel real, tangible, and justified. It was a sobering reminder of how fragile safety can be when dealing with wildlife, even in a protected park. After that, we packed up and continued with the trip, but the memory of that night stayed with me. It was a mix of fear, respect, and awe. Fear because of the raw power and danger of the wild. Respect for the teachers who managed to keep us safe despite our vulnerability, and awe at the experience itself. The kind of fear that teaches you lessons you never forget. I remember reflecting on it later, thinking about how we were so exposed, so completely at the mercy of nature, and yet survived without a scratch. It made me more aware of my surroundings, more careful, more grateful for the people who look out for you, and more conscious of how small humans really are in the grand scheme of things. Looking back, I am glad I can share this experience. It wasn't a story of supernatural terror or mythical creatures. It was real life, raw and dangerous, and the fear we felt was genuine. That night, near the river, taught me something about vulnerability and courage, and it's a memory I carry even now. We survived, we were unharmed, and the experience became a story of caution and respect for the wild. It ended with us walking away from the river, tired but safe, knowing we'd faced a real danger and had come out intact. That clarity, that relief, and the knowledge that we had truly witnessed a small part of nature's raw power, that was the ending. The night was over, the river flowed, and the hyenas returned to the wild, leaving us with a story that would stay with us forever. The memory of that night remains sharp, and even years later, I can hear that distant laughter in my head and feel that same tension in my chest. But unlike then, now it carries no fear, only respect, and a deep understanding of how close we came to something truly wild. I remember the first time I went to that lake, though I had never really camped before. It was one of those places that seemed harmless at first. The water calm, the trees tall and quiet, but there was something about it that settled into the back of my mind like a warning I didn't quite understand. I had only gone once just to see it, and I was accompanied by my brother who had spent enough time there to know when things could go wrong. He didn't let us stay once it started getting dark. Even then, the stories I'd heard about the lake pressed into me, an unease I couldn't shake no matter how hard I tried. Years earlier, a family had gone camping there. A father, a mother, and their little boy, and they had died in the most horrific way imaginable. A bear had mauled them near the cabins by the lake. The details were blurred in local news reports, but the images that lingered in my mind were vivid enough. The idea that something so ordinary in the wilderness could end a family's life in an instant. People whispered that if you went near the cabins now, you could sometimes hear screams or see something out of the corner of your eye. I never really believed it. At least I told myself I didn't, but after hearing the story, I understood how a place like that could make anyone feel uneasy. There were other rumors too, about strange gatherings by the lake. Reports of satanic rituals, occult practices, chanting late at night. My other brother had once gone there with his classmates. They had been walking along a road near the lake when they noticed figures in robes, chanting under the dim light of a half moon. My brother described how they froze, turned off their lamps, and waited silently until the figures left. The feeling of being watched, he said, stayed with them long after they were home. I could imagine it, the trees swallowing up any sound behind them, while the chanting echoed unnaturally clear through the night air. I didn't go to the lake with the intention of camping, at least not in the traditional sense. I just wanted to see the water and the cabins where the family had died. The path to the cabins was rough, overgrown in places with roots and brambles that snagged at shoes and clothing. Even in daylight, the forest felt dense, oppressive almost, as though the trees themselves were leaning in, watching. There was a narrow dirt trail that led down to the water, and I followed it slowly, trying not to disturb anything. The air smelled faintly of moss and damp soil, and there was a strange quiet, as though even the birds and insects were cautious here. The cabins themselves were in disrepair, the wood rotting, windows broken or missing, doors hanging on rusted hinges. I stayed at the edge of the clearing for a while, looking over the water. The lake was wide and dark, reflecting the sky in a way that made it hard to tell how deep it really was. Small waves lapped at the shore, but there was no wind. The place felt abandoned, but I could still feel the weight of what had happened there. The silence was heavy, like it had substance. I kept expecting to see movement, some sign that life was still present in a place that had known so much death. but there was nothing. As I moved along the shoreline, I noticed the forest thickening behind the cabins. It was easy to imagine how a bear could wander close without warning, how quickly a normal day could turn into a nightmare. My heart started to race, not because of anything I could see, but because of what I imagined. The sudden snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the possibility of something enormous and dangerous just out of sight. I told myself it was paranoia, that the bear had been long gone, that the family's deaths were just that, tragic accidents. Yet the fear lingered. I decided to leave before night fell. My brother's warnings echoed in my mind. Don't stay after dark, don't wander near the cabins, don't attract attention. As I walked back along the trail, the forest seemed to close in more tightly. Every shadow stretched and shifted. Every sound, the distant plop of a fish in the lake, a bird landing somewhere unseen, felt amplified. I tried to focus on the path, on keeping my footing over roots and rocks, but my mind kept wandering to the stories. The bear, the chanting, the robes in the night. At one point, I thought I saw a figure between the trees, just at the edge of my vision. I froze, staring, heart hammering. It was gone in an instant, probably a trick of the light or a tree bent in an odd way. Still, the pause left me tense, alert. I reminded myself that the human mind does strange things in unfamiliar places, especially when it knows stories of danger and death. The sun was low when I reached the road that led out of the forest. Shadows stretched long, and the air cooled quickly. I could feel a faint shiver run down my spine, not from cold, but from awareness. There were no people around, no lights, no movement. Just the road, the forest, and the lake behind it. I kept walking, keeping my pace steady, eyes scanning for anything unusual, anything that might remind me of the rituals my brother had described. There was nothing, of course, and yet the tension didn't leave me. By the time I reached the car, the sun had disappeared entirely behind the hills. I sat for a moment, doors locked, engine running, looking back at the dark outline of the forest. I could feel the pull of the place, the way it demanded respect, how easily it could overwhelm anyone who ignored it. I realized that the lake, the cabins, the stories, they were all reminders that the wilderness could be beautiful, but it could also be unforgiving. It didn't need ghosts or demons to be dangerous. A bear, a misstep, or a group of people performing rituals could all turn a simple night in the woods into something terrifying. Driving away, I felt a sense of relief, but also a strange kind of respect. The forest didn't need to scare me with the supernatural. Its reality was enough. The weight of history, the danger of the natural world, the knowledge that people could act in ways that were frightening and unpredictable. I thought about the family, about my brother and his classmates, and about the warnings I had received. I understood then why my brother had insisted we leave before nightfall. It wasn't superstition. It was common sense. That day, I learned that fear doesn't have to come from ghosts or myths. It can come from knowing the truth of a place, from understanding what has happened there, and from recognizing what might happen if caution is ignored. I never went camping at that lake, and I never will. I don't need to. I know enough about it to respect it, to stay away when it's dark, and to remember that real danger doesn't announce itself with lights or screams. It waits quietly in shadows, in the stillness, in the very ground beneath your feet. And sometimes, I think that awareness is more than enough to keep you safe. It's not about fear for fear's sake. It's about knowing when to walk away, when to respect the rules of a place that doesn't bend to human expectations. That night, as I drove home under the stars and the darkening sky, I realized that understanding reality, even its harshest truths, can be more comforting than any story about spirits or ghosts. The lake will always hold its stories, but I will always hold the knowledge of its real dangers, and that has kept me safe ever since. The memory of that day stays with me, not as a tale of horror, but as a lesson. Fear grounded in reality is powerful, precise, and sometimes life-saving. I've always considered myself a seasoned camper. I've slept under stars from Monterey Bay to Port Townsend, always finding a strange comfort in the solitude and rawness of the outdoors. There's something about the forest and the coast that feels familiar, almost safe in its unpredictability. I've had close encounters with wildlife, storms that tore through tents, and nights when the wind seemed to speak in voices. But nothing had ever truly unsettled me. Until the Olympic Coast. It started as a regular trip. My partner and I had picked a small hiking campsite not far from the whole rainforest. The hike was long, but manageable, and the spot itself was quiet, tucked among thick, dripping moss and massive trees that seemed to lean toward each other like conspirators. The air was heavy and damp, and the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves filled every breath. The sun had already dipped below the horizon when we finished setting up the tent, leaving just a muted glow through the canopy. I double-checked the tent stakes, arranged the sleeping bags, and made sure the lantern was working. Everything felt ordinary, almost serene. I remember drifting off easily, lulled by the distant sounds of the forest, the rush of a stream somewhere close, the soft croak of frogs, and the occasional call of an owl. Then, in the middle of the night, I woke to movement. My eyes snapped open because something felt off. It wasn't the usual rustle of wind or a branch falling. This was deliberate, careful, deliberate in a way that immediately made my chest tighten. I heard the light, almost imperceptible crunch of footsteps, or maybe claws, against leaves and dirt. I assumed it was a raccoon or some other small animal, nothing serious, so I slowly reached for my camp lantern. My hand trembled as I flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness in a thin circle around the tent, and I forced myself to sit up and unzip the door. That's when it hit me, the sound of a growl. It was unlike anything I've ever heard. Low, guttural, resonating deep enough that it vibrated through my chest. Not a bear, not a wolf. Something else, something heavy, large, patient, and deliberate. Coupled with the growl was the sound of weight shifting, the sort of movement that suggested massive size. My body froze in terror. I could feel the ground beneath me, but the instinct to curl up and disappear overpowered everything. I hit the floor of the tent, scrambling to shut the lantern off, the sudden darkness making every nerve in my body scream. Once the light was gone, the forest seemed to close in. The growl didn't repeat, nothing did. Dead silence. But every small sound was amplified. My breathing, my heart hammering against my rib cage, the subtle sway of branches in the wind. Time stretched unnaturally long. I lay there, rigid and silent, listening, every muscle coiled and ready to react. My mind ran through every possibility. Bear, cougar, human? Nothing seemed to fit, and the more I listened, the more my rational mind fought against the pure, bone-deep fear rising inside me. I didn't move until the first light of dawn filtered through the tent. The air was crisp and heavy with moisture, dew clinging to everything, and the forest was waking. Birds called out tentatively, the rustle of small animals returning to their morning routines. I forced myself to breathe, each exhale shaky. I unzipped the tent slowly and poked my head out. Nothing. No movement, no large footprints, not even signs of struggle. Just the forest, serene and unchanged, as if it had been holding its breath all night and decided to release at the moment the sun came up. I spent the morning retracing the perimeter of our campsite, searching for any sign of the creature or animal that had made that sound. I examined the ground, the moss, the leaves. No tracks, no scat, nothing to indicate that something large had been there. Every step I took felt heavier than the last, like I was carrying the memory of the growl in my bones. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a bear had been nearby, but decided to leave without leaving a trace. Maybe I had misinterpreted sounds in the dark, but nothing made sense. I had been quiet, careful, and had seen and heard enough of the outdoors to know the difference between a raccoon and something massive. When we packed up and drove to the ranger station later that day, I felt compelled to tell someone. The ranger station itself was small, a humble wooden building at the edge of the forest with maps tacked to the walls and a faint smell of mildew. I explained everything, every detail from the sound of the growl to the movement I heard in the darkness. The rangers exchanged glances, something subtle but palpable passing between them. One of them, the older guy, went pale. He nodded and said he would check it out. Within the hour, he was gone in a jeep, the engine fading into the distance along the muddy trail. I waited, restless, staring out the dusty window. Hours passed. He returned eventually, his face tight, the same color as the ash in a fire. He told me he hadn't found anything. No tracks, no prints, no signs of disturbance. It wasn't just me. The ranger admitted that he had never experienced anything like what I described in that area. He had spent decades in the Olympic National Park and dealt with plenty of wildlife encounters. Yet this didn't fit anything known to him. The unease in his expression mirrored my own. I left the Olympic coast with a sense of lingering tension. I've camped countless places, but this experience stayed with me. I've tried to rationalize it, thinking perhaps the sound was amplified by the dense forest. Perhaps a bear had circled our camp but never left a trace. But even now, months later, my stomach knots when I remember the growl, the way the darkness pressed against me in that tent, the almost palpable sense of a presence so large and aware that it didn't need to be seen. I've returned to the Olympic coast since, to other areas, and never experienced anything similar. That particular section of the Hoh rainforest remains an anomaly in my mind, a place where logic and reality seem to bend slightly, a reminder that the natural world still holds mysteries beyond comprehension. I don't tell many people about it, because most would shrug it off as exaggeration, mishearing, or imagination. But I know what I heard. I know what I felt. And part of me will never camp there the same way again. The experience left me more cautious, more aware of the subtleties in the wilderness. I now triple-check campsite perimeters, listen longer at night, and respect the silence. That night, however, remains clear in my memory, not just because of fear, but because it reminded me that even in the places we feel safest, the wild has its secrets, and some of them might never reveal themselves, no matter how hard we search. The ending, for me, was simple but profound. I survived, we left the area unharmed, and no physical danger materialized. But the lesson endured. Respect the forest, respect the unknown, and understand that sometimes the scariest experiences are not about being attacked, but about realizing just how close the edge of the unknown really is. I left with a story that could never be fully explained, a memory etched in adrenaline and silence, and a newfound respect for the darkness of the Olympic coast. I remember that night like it happened yesterday, even though it was years ago. It was my first time ever camping, part of a 7th grade field trip, and from the moment we left home, I hated it. The bus ride had been long, about 5 hours, and every minute felt like a punishment. I couldn't stand being away from my family, away from the comfort of my own bed, my own room, the safety of my familiar little world. Everything about the camp made me anxious. The smell of pine and wet earth, the creaking of the cabins, the unfamiliar sounds of the forest at night. I tried to sleep. Really, I had, but it was impossible. The cot was stiff and wooden, like it had been designed specifically to punish anyone who tried to rest on it. My pillow was thin, flat, and smelled faintly of something I couldn't identify, probably years of camp kids' sweat and sunscreen. I lay there staring at the ceiling, counting the boards, listening to every tiny sound, hoping sleep would come. It didn't. Hours passed like minutes, but felt like centuries, and eventually I gave up. I got up quietly, careful not to wake anyone else. The cabin was dark, and the small flash of the hall light from the common area outside made the shadows in the room seem deeper, darker. I slipped out into the cold night, carrying a little book light, my favorite Christopher Pike novel clutched in my hands. Sitting in front of the cabin felt safer than lying on that awful cot, even though I felt uneasy. I was alone, but the camp was supposed to be safe, so I told myself that being outside was fine. I turned on the book light and started reading, my head down, pretending the forest wasn't there, pretending I wasn't aware of the strange, creeping feeling that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I kept glancing up over and over. Every shadow seemed like it moved slightly. Every rustle in the underbrush made me tense. I tried to focus on my book, but I couldn't. Something felt wrong, though I couldn't explain why. It was a feeling that sank into my chest and made my stomach churn. My heart was racing, but I was frozen in place, held captive by my own fear. Then happened. I must have shifted the book just a little because the light caught something in the darkness. Two glowing eyes stared back at me. At first, I thought it might be a reflection from some random object, maybe even another kid playing a prank, but the eyes didn't blink or move unnaturally. They were fixed on me, steady and unblinking, and my stomach dropped. I dropped the book without thinking, and the light fell off to the side, illuminating a paw, massive and muscular, with sharp claws gripping the ground. I froze entirely. My mind screamed, but my body refused to move. I could see the rest of it then. A mountain lion, huge and silent, creeping closer, its body low to the ground. The moonlight glinted faintly off its sleek, tawny fur. Its tail twitched just slightly, a signal of its concentration, its predator instincts in full control. The animal was closer than I realized, closer than any human should ever be. The thought of screaming, of running, flashed in my mind, but I knew instinctively that any sudden movement would trigger its attack. I was completely, utterly exposed. My mind went through a rapid-fire list of consequences. If it attacked, I might not survive, and if I tried to fight, I had no chance. I also thought in some strange, absurd way of my dad. He had drilled into me the importance of following rules and being careful, and I could already imagine his disappointment if I got attacked, because I had been careless. Time stretched. The seconds felt like hours. I couldn't move my limbs. I could hear its breathing, low and controlled, the faint rasp of its whiskers brushing against leaves and twigs. The forest was otherwise silent, the only sound the occasional rustle of a distant animal, probably a deer or raccoon, oblivious to the tension in front of the cabin. I tried to slow my breathing, to keep calm, to think. Panic threatened to overtake me, but somehow I clung to reason. I had to get back inside, but how? I couldn't risk looking at it or reaching for the door openly. My hands fumbled in the dark, searching blindly. I stretched my arm back, feeling the cool metal of the door handle. My heart was hammering in my chest, but I gripped it and twisted, forcing myself backward into the cabin. My feet slipped slightly on the wooden steps as I fell, but I managed to get inside without making a sound. I slammed the door shut and leaned against it, trembling, gasping, trying to convince myself I was safe now. I could hear the faint scratching outside as the mountain lion padded away, but it didn't attack. I didn't dare move for a while, listening to the night, my own heart, trying to steady my nerves. Eventually, I managed to climb back onto the cot. I lay there rigid, replaying every second in my mind, analyzing my mistakes, thinking about how close I had come to disaster. I stared at the ceiling until the first light of dawn seeped through the windows, washing the room in soft gold. One of the other girls woke up and noticed the book light lying on the floor. I told her it must have been the wind that banged the door. She didn't question it, and I didn't volunteer any more information. Morning came fully, and our teacher made the rounds to wake everyone. I had already stashed my book back on the shelf, pretending it had been safely inside all night. I got in trouble, yes, but only for leaving a library book outside. The teacher didn't know, and I didn't tell. I couldn't. The memory of those glowing eyes, the silent, deadly patience of that mountain lion, haunted me for a long time afterward. I had survived purely by instinct and luck, and I knew it. That encounter had changed the way I thought about the outdoors, about wild animals, and about the fragility of life in the wilderness. Years later, I still remember the cold night air, the smell of the forest, the fear, and the silent strength of the mountain lion. I've learned to respect the wild in a way I never did as a child. That night, I realized that nature does not negotiate, and it does not forgive carelessness. I never told anyone the full story, but I think about it whenever I go camping now, carefully checking my surroundings, aware of every sound and movement in the dark. That night could have ended in tragedy, but it didn't. I made it back into the cabin alive, my body trembling, my heart racing, but I survived. And that survival, pure and simple, was enough. It was a lesson in fear, respect, and the fragile, precious nature of life that I've carried with me ever since. It took me a long time to be able to go camping again. Every creek, every shadow, every rustle of leaves made me pause, made me remember that night. But I learned to manage it. I learned to prepare, to stay aware, to respect the rules, and most importantly, to respect the wild. That night, I didn't just survive a mountain lion. I learned that fear, awareness, and careful action could save my life. It was a terrifying, unforgettable experience, but it ended clearly. I was safe, I was alive, and I had learned one of the most important lessons I've ever known. The morning was cold, colder than I expected for early November in western Wisconsin. The frost had clung to the edges of the leaves, and the low sunlight barely cut through the thick trees at the base of the hills. I had been hunting with my dad for years, and I knew every sound of these woods. The rustle of leaves from squirrels, the distant cracking of branches under the weight of deer, even the low hum of wind moving through the pine trees. That morning, the woods were unnaturally quiet. The kind of quiet that pressed against your chest and made your own heartbeat feel loud. We left the hunting shack before the sun came up, taking the ATV up the hill to one of the stand we had built ourselves. It was a steep climb, dirt rutted from years of ATVs, with scattered rocks that could easily make a wheel slip. My dad drove, slowly, carefully navigating the hill as the engine rumbled softly. I rode behind him, gripping the handles tightly, aware of how easy it would be to slide off the path and into the underbrush. The air smelled crisp and wet, a mix of frost and the lingering decay of leaves from last season. We parked the ATV near the top of the hill and started up the path to the tree stand, boots crunching against the frost-covered leaves. My dad had always taught me to step lightly, to mimic his footsteps so the sound of our movement would blend into one. That way, we made less noise and had a better chance of spotting deer. For a while, the forest was still, nothing moving but the occasional flutter of a bird taking flight in the distance. Around halfway to the ATV, after we decided to head back down for coffee, I noticed it first. The sound of footsteps, subtle, almost tentative, following ours. At first, I thought it was another hunter, maybe someone on a different schedule. But the rhythm was wrong. I matched my steps with my dad's, and the steps behind us matched mine exactly. Not one step ahead or behind, but perfectly mirrored. My stomach tightened. I froze for a second, glancing over my shoulder, but all I saw were trees and the dim shapes of the hills. I continued walking, trying to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a deer stepping on sticks, though I knew deer didn't walk like that, especially not behind you in perfect sync. The noise persisted, keeping pace with each step I took. My pulse began to rise. I nudged my dad's shoulder, and he turned his head slightly, eyebrows knitting together. We both knew something was off. Then I saw it, a pale face, round and unnerving, peeking out from behind a tree about 30 yards up the hill. It was small, malformed in a way that made it impossible to identify at first glance. Its eyes were dark, unblinking, and locked onto us like a predator assessing its prey. The rest of its body was hidden, pressed against the tree, but I could make out a hunched shoulder and a twisted arm. I felt a cold wave of fear, instinctively trying to tell myself it was just a person wearing camouflage or a prankster, but something in the way it moved and the way it watched us was wrong, unnatural. I stopped moving, heart hammering, and my dad did the same. I felt the cold sweat trickling down my back, even in the frosty air. The figure stayed in place, following our movements without flinching. It didn't step out from behind the tree fully at first, just watched, making me more aware of how alone we really were. There were no other hunters around, no voices, no vehicles, nothing but the empty woods and the rhythmic crunch of our own footsteps in the leaves. My dad whispered, low and urgent, to get to the ATV. We started moving again, keeping our eyes on the figure, who began to slowly emerge from behind the tree. Its movements were deliberate, almost mechanical, as if it was testing how quickly it could follow us without being noticed. The sunlight had risen a little, cutting through the trees in thin streams, but the shadows were still long, and the figure remained pale against the dark bark, grotesque in its thinness and malformed limbs. We reached the ATV. My dad fumbled with the keys, his hands trembling slightly, though he tried to mask it. I couldn't take my eyes off the figure as it stepped fully out from behind the tree. Its movements were jerky, uncoordinated, but it kept pace with us, moving in and out of the shadows like a predator circling. My dad hit the throttle, and the ATV roared to life, throwing up dirt and leaves as we accelerated down the hill. The figure didn't immediately chase, but I caught glimpses of it moving between trees, keeping pace as if it had no other plan than to follow. We reached the bottom of the hill, and my dad pushed the ATV faster, racing down the winding paths toward the hunting shack. Each corner of the trail revealed more glimpses of the figure, more of its twisted form, until finally it stopped at the edge of the trees, just before the wide, open clearing near the shack. It watched us go, its small head tilting slightly, then retreated into the darkness of the woods. When we arrived at the shack, I was shaking so badly I could barely get off the ATV. My dad immediately checked the schedule board, ensuring no one else was marked in our area. The rest of the crew hadn't shown up yet. The property was empty, and the woods around us were silent again. But the silence didn't feel safe. I could still feel the presence of whatever had been behind us, the way it had followed, the way it had watched. We left the property soon after, deciding to return home rather than continue hunting that day. My dad later went back and successfully harvested a deer during a different outing, but he never mentioned what had happened that morning. He treated it like nothing had happened, focusing on hunting strategy, deer movement, and weather conditions. I, however, could not shake the image. The pale face, the jerky, inhuman movements, the exact mimicry of our footsteps, it haunted me. I stopped going into those woods altogether. Every time I drive past them or see a hill in that region, I feel that same uneasy tightening in my chest, a reminder that whatever was following us wasn't human, wasn't animal, and wasn't something I could rationalize away. I've replayed it countless times, tried to convince myself it was a prank or a trick of the light, but nothing fits. The fear was real, the stalking was real, and the figure's presence was undeniable. I eventually came to a decision that grounded me. I wouldn't let fear control my life, but I also wouldn't go back into that forest alone. I stayed away, respected the silence of those hills, and when I do hear about hunters heading into that area, I remind them to stay aware, stay together, and trust their instincts. The woods are full of things we can't always see clearly, and sometimes the most terrifying ones are the ones that follow quietly, step for step, waiting until you turn around. I've lived with that memory for years now, and while I've moved on with other hunting trips and woods exploration, the lesson remains clear. Some places are not meant to be explored casually, and some presences are not meant to be confronted. Safety, awareness, and respect are the only things that keep you from becoming a permanent part of the forest's dark secrets. Even now, when the wind rustles just right through the trees outside my house, I think of that morning. I hear the faint echo of footsteps behind me, and I know that whatever was out there that day still exists somewhere in those hills, waiting, watching, and following anyone foolish enough to mimic the rhythm of life it knows so well. I haven't been back, and I don't plan to. Some things are better left unseen, and some woods better left untouched. The fear may fade over time, but the memory is permanent, etched into my mind with every detail, every sound, every step I took that morning. It's a reminder that realism can be terrifying, and that not all horror needs to be supernatural to be unforgettable. I was driving through southwestern Wyoming, winding through dirt roads that seemed to stretch endlessly into the mountains, far from any sign of civilization. The air was dry and crisp, carrying that distinct desert smell, a mix of dust, sage, and the faint hint of something mineral in the soil. The sun had already begun to dip toward the horizon, stretching long shadows over the rocky terrain, and I remember feeling a quiet sort of isolation that was both peaceful and a little unsettling. I had been in remote places before, but there was something different about this stretch of land, something that made me unusually alert despite the calm. We were about 15 or 20 miles from any paved road, the car crunching over gravel and loose dirt when I first noticed the pillars. They weren't huge, maybe 5 to 6 feet tall at most, but what caught my attention was their precision. They were made of flat rocks, the kind you'd find scattered across the desert floor, stacked carefully on top of each other in perfectly circular formations. Each pillar had a square, a hole carved in the middle, a space you could look through, but perfectly shaped as if someone had measured it with tools I couldn't imagine they had in such a desolate area. The first time I looked through one, my mind insisted I must be imagining it. But no, when I peered through the square, my eyes landed directly on a lone house far off in the distance. It wasn't abandoned or obviously inhabited from what I could tell. Just a simple structure, standing solitary among the plains and low hills, with nothing else around it for miles. And the more I looked, the more I noticed the subtle oddities around the pillars. The plants, small scrubby bushes and patches of grass, seemed to grow differently near the pillars. They weren't lush or overgrown, but there was a rhythm to their placement, almost as if the earth itself had been disturbed, rearranged to follow the shape of these constructions. I told myself it was probably my imagination, just a trick of the fading light, but the feeling lingered. Over the next few hours, driving slowly along the dirt roads, I kept spotting more of these pillars. 5, maybe 6 in total, all within a 3-mile radius. Each one mirrored the others in size and design. The same perfectly circular stacks, the same square eye hole, and each one pointed toward the same distant house. The geometry of it didn't make sense. I tried to figure out logically. Perhaps it was some old land survey, maybe markers left by ranchers or miners long ago, but I had seen enough old markers and relics of the past to know that nothing else looked like this. Nothing was this precise. The square holes didn't look chipped by natural erosion, and the rocks weren't cemented or mortared together. They were balanced, stacked with painstaking care. Whoever had done this had spent hours, maybe days, arranging them by hand in the middle of nowhere. And for what reason, I had no clue. I stopped the car near one of the pillars and got out. The desert wind whipped around me, lifting dust and dry leaves, carrying a silence that was almost loud in its emptiness. Standing there, I could hear my own breathing, the distant cry of a hawk, the faint hum of the wind through the rocks. I crouched down and examined the structure more closely. Each stone was carefully chosen, flat and even, and there was no sign of modern tools. No markings, no scratches, no cement residue, just raw rock. The square hole looked impossibly sharp, like someone had spent hours chipping and fitting the stones perfectly to create it. I tried to imagine who could have done this. Locals, maybe? But why? And why so far from any road? Why not use cement if it was meant to last? Everything about it suggested someone meticulous, someone patient, and yet there was no record of anything like it anywhere in this part of Wyoming. The sun sank lower, and the shadows grew long, stretching across the desert and wrapping around the pillars. I took another look through the hole toward the house in the distance. The angle was perfect, as if each pillar had been positioned so that someone standing at the base could look straight at the house through the square. I thought about climbing the nearest hill to get a better view of the house, but something held me back. Maybe it was just the fading light, or maybe it was that creeping unease in my chest. There was no one around, no other cars, no animals, nothing. Just me, the wind, and these strange constructions. I spent the next hour driving between the pillars, slowing down at each one to take it all in. The desert was growing colder now, the wind sharper. The light was fading so fast that the rocks took on dark, shadowy forms, twisting into shapes that weren't there in the daylight. My mind began to race, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a long-abandoned property, some eccentric landowner with a fascination for geometry. Maybe the pillars were markers for underground wells or old mining claims, something mundane and logical. But the square holes, the alignment, the care, it didn't make sense. Nothing about it did. And still, no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, the hair on my neck remained on edge. Night began to fall fully, and I knew it was time to leave. I looked back at the pillars one last time from the dirt road, silhouetted against the deepening twilight. Their shapes were stark, almost deliberate, like a warning or a message I couldn't read. I drove off slowly, casting glances in the rearview mirror, the car's tires crunching over the gravel. I didn't stop to take pictures. Somehow, I didn't want to disturb the place, didn't want to feel like I was intruding on something I wasn't supposed to see. By the time I reached a paved road and civilization felt close again, the eerie tension in my chest had loosened. The experience stayed with me, though not in a nightmarish way, but as a quiet, nagging question. Who had made those pillars and why? What purpose did the perfect circles and the square holes serve? I never found out. I tried researching old maps, local history, and even forums for curious desert structures, but there was nothing. No records, no photographs, nothing about anyone creating such a thing in the middle of the Wyoming desert. Over the years, I've thought about it often. Every time I drive past a lonely hill or desert plateau, every time I notice something out of place in a remote area, I realized one thing as I replayed the memory. It didn't have to be explained to leave an impact. The pillars themselves were enough. They were proof that someone had cared enough to create something extraordinary in a place utterly inhospitable, that they had dedicated effort to align it with a house, to shape the earth around it in ways that made you stop and notice. I never went back to those roads, but I carry the image with me. And somehow, in that quiet, endless desert, amidst rocks and wind and isolation, I found something human, someone's careful, deliberate presence in a place that makes you feel completely alone. That presence, more than anything, was haunting in a way that didn't rely on anything supernatural, just the sharp, impossible perfection of something made by hand in the middle of nowhere. It stayed with me, a reminder that even in the most barren places, human intention can leave a mark that refuses to be ignored. I never figured out who built them or why, but knowing they existed, seeing them with my own eyes, and feeling that quiet, unshakable tension in the desert night, that was enough. The pillars are gone from my daily life, but in my memory, they remain perfectly circular, perfectly aligned, staring silently toward a house in the distance, a mystery as sharp and enduring as the rocks themselves. I was in Sebastopol, Northern California, on a crisp late autumn morning. The air had that sharp, piney smell that makes you feel alive and cautious at the same time. My goal that day was simple: find some mushrooms. The park I chose was large, densely wooded, and crisscrossed with narrow dirt trails, many of them just paths beaten into the forest floor by previous hikers and animals. The ground was covered in a thick carpet of dead pine needles, and every step I took made a soft, muffled crunch. There were massive trees everywhere, ancient and tall, their trunks gnarled and dark, the kind that made you feel small and watchful, even when the sun was shining. Among the trees were huge, dark rocks scattered like the remnants of some prehistoric collapse. They were slick with moss and moisture, and they made the forest floor uneven, forcing me to watch every step. I wandered deeper into the park, focusing on the patches of decaying needles and the little hollows where mushrooms often sprouted. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves high above or the distant call of a crow. I reached a particularly dense area where the trees were so close together that the light barely touched the ground. Here, the pine needles were thick and the air was damp, heavy with the smell of wet earth and fallen leaves. I bent over to inspect a cluster of small brown mushrooms, crouching so low that my hands brushed the needles. When I stood up, I realized I needed to move around a large tree to continue along the narrow path I had been following. I stepped to the side, careful to avoid the tangled roots and slippery rocks. It was then, in a fraction of a second, when I looked up to gauge my footing, that I saw it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Something was on the end of one of the higher branches of a massive pine, dark against the gray-green sky, filtered through the canopy. It had 2 legs, long, thin arms lifted in a rigid, unnatural position. It was moving, running in place on the very edge of the branch. Its legs didn't seem to touch the wood at all, hovering or moving with a speed that made my stomach tighten. Its body was completely dark, black or brown, all one color. The movement was frantic but oddly precise, like it had a purpose I couldn't understand. I froze, my attention locked on it while my mind raced. I've seen monkeys before in documentaries and zoos, but never in the wild in California. And yet, this looked like some kind of primate, or maybe even a person. But the proportions didn't match a human, and the way it balanced so effortlessly at the edge of the branch was beyond anything I'd seen. My eyes flicked down to where I was stepping, but the forest floor felt suddenly unstable. Pine needles, small twigs, and bits of bark fell from the branches above. The figure continued its strange, rhythmic running in place. The more I watched, the more impossible it seemed. The way it moved suggested strength and agility that a human could not possess. Its arms flailed just slightly, long and muscular, but there was no hesitation in the movement. It seemed deliberate, as if it were exercising, stretching, or performing some unknown ritual. I slowly stepped closer, not wanting to make any sudden moves. My heart was hammering in my chest, my mind torn between fascination and fear. As I approached, the figure abruptly stopped. One moment, it was running in place with impossible speed. The next, it was gone. Just gone. No sound, no rustling, nothing to indicate it had fallen or jumped. It simply vanished from sight. For a long moment, I stood there, frozen. The branches above were empty, the forest floor as it had been. My eyes darted from tree to tree, searching for any movement, any sign of what I had just seen. Nothing. My mind tried to rationalize it. Was it a person committing some bizarre act? But how could anyone support themselves like that on a thin branch without touching it? Was it a bear? Bears climb trees, but they don't run in place, and their legs certainly don't hover above branches. I moved cautiously forward, stepping over roots and rocks, scanning every tree, every shadow. The forest felt alive in a way that made the hair on my arms stand on end. The usual bird calls were distant, almost subdued, and the wind had died down. Even the smell of the forest seemed thicker, as if holding its breath with me. I circled the tree where I had first seen it, examining the branches. There were small scratches in the bark, fine claw marks, but nothing that explained the running figure. Some pine needles and bark had fallen where it had been, but nothing larger, no sign of a body or an animal. I even checked behind the massive rocks nearby, thinking maybe it had leapt to the ground and hidden. Nothing. My rational brain fought with my senses. I thought about all the wildlife in Northern California. Raccoons, bobcats, coyotes, even the occasional mountain lion. None of them moved like that. None of them could balance on a branch in the air and run in place with such control. I considered the possibility of a big bird like an owl, but this wasn't flying, it was running in place. And the arms were all wrong. I decided to step back and regain a bit of distance. The sun was dropping behind the trees, casting long shadows that made the forest feel darker, even in the afternoon. I realized I'd spent nearly an hour in that small area, just staring and trying to make sense of what I had seen. The unease in my chest was growing into something sharper, a low, gnawing fear I couldn't shake. I continued walking slowly toward the trailhead, my eyes constantly flicking upward, scanning for any sign of movement. Every tree looked like it could hide something, every branch a potential perch for whatever had been there. When I finally reached a clearing where the light broke through the canopy, I stopped to catch my breath. My legs were tense, my back stiff from crouching and stepping over roots. And then I saw something that made me pause completely. Among the fallen pine needles at the edge of the clearing, I noticed small, dark footprints. They were elongated, thin, and strangely human-like, but the toes seemed slightly off. The prints were fresh, leading away from the tree where I had seen the figure. They disappeared into the underbrush, no trace beyond a few feet. I studied the prints for a while, turning them over in my mind. Whatever I had seen had come down from the tree and moved silently into the forest. My fear shifted into a cautious curiosity. The forest was full of things I didn't know, things I might never see again. But whatever it was, it hadn't threatened me, hadn't made a sound, hadn't followed. I finally decided it was time to leave the area. I walked briskly back to the trailhead, my senses still on high alert. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made my heart jump, but the forest remained silent in response. When I reached the parking lot, I paused and looked back. The dense trees and scattered rocks now seemed ordinary, almost peaceful, yet the memory of that running figure lingered in my mind. I left the park that day with more questions than answers. Later, I researched wildlife sightings in Sebastopol and the surrounding forests. There were occasional reports of unusual primates, escaped exotic pets, or large unknown mammals, but nothing verified. I realized that the forest was home to secrets I might never fully understand. And sometimes the most inexplicable things were simply part of the natural world, hiding just out of reach. That day taught me something important. Nature is unpredictable, full of creatures that can astonish and unsettle us. Even in a well-known park, surrounded by familiar trees and paths, there could be moments that make you question what you see. Whatever that figure was, it stayed in its world above the forest floor, and I stayed in mine. The encounter left me cautious, observant, and profoundly aware of the forest's hidden life. I would return to that park, but I would always watch the trees a little more carefully, my eyes tracing every branch, every shadow, knowing that some things exist just beyond our understanding, quietly moving and waiting. By the time I left Sebastopol, the sky was golden and pink, the kind of evening that makes you forget all fear. Yet in my mind, the image of that running figure never faded. It wasn't supernatural, it wasn't a ghost or a legend. It was real, tangible, and yet utterly mysterious. The forest kept its secrets, and I kept the memory, a reminder that the world is larger and stranger than I sometimes allow myself to believe. I was walking through a small wooded area in Shropshire with two mates, a path I'd gone along before, but this night it felt different. The path was made up of loose stones that shifted underfoot, each step echoing faintly in the quiet. The occasional street lamp dotted the path, but their light barely pierced the darkness. Shadows clung to the edges of the trees, twisting and stretching in ways that made my stomach tighten with unease. We were laughing a little at first, trying to shake off that creeping feeling of being watched, but that laugh felt forced, brittle in the cold night air. As we moved deeper into the woods, the crunch of stones beneath our boots seemed unnaturally loud. I noticed my own breathing was sharper, quicker, and I could feel the tension in my shoulders growing. Then, out of nowhere, there was a sound that froze me mid-step. It wasn't the normal crunching of our own feet. This was heavier, slower, deliberate, like someone or something was stepping right behind us. My heart started hammering against my rib cage, each beat echoing in my ears louder than the faint wind rustling the branches. I glanced at my mates, both of whom were suddenly rigid, their faces pale and frozen. One of them caught my eye, and the look on his face was enough to confirm that I wasn't imagining it. We weren't alone. I turned slowly, trying to rationalize what I might be seeing. There was nothing at first, just the dimly lit path and the jagged shadows of trees. But then I saw it. Only a few feet away, looming over the path, was this enormous black figure. It was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders that seemed to swallow up the light around them. Its form was thick with what looked like fur, but it was blacker than anything I'd seen, absorbing the faint glow from the lamps instead of reflecting it. The first thing that hit me were the eyes. 2 red pinpoints of light, glowing steadily, staring straight at us. The glow wasn't flickering, wasn't reflecting anything. It was raw, unblinking, impossible. I felt my stomach drop and a cold sweat break out along my back. Every instinct screamed at me to move, to run, to just get away from whatever that thing was. I could feel my legs stiffening, like the ground itself was holding me in place, and I could hear the uneven crunch of its steps as it moved slightly closer. The stones under its feet made a heavy, wet-sounding crack, not like bone or gravel, but like a deep, compact weight pressing against the earth. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst through my chest, and my throat had gone completely dry. I grabbed the arm of my mate closest to me, and we froze for a moment, just staring, calculating, trying to understand what we were seeing. But there was nothing to understand. It was real. It was huge. It was close. And we had no weapons, no plan, no chance of staying calm. The moment stretched, suffocating, until finally we moved. Not carefully, not strategically, just instinctively. We booked it. I couldn't even hear my own feet properly over the sound of my pulse in my ears. My mates and I ran the 5 minutes to his house in a blur of adrenaline and terror. The image of that thing seared into my mind. I could hear the snap of branches behind us, the rustle of movement that wasn't ours, but each time I dared to glance back, the red eyes would be gone. And yet, I could feel the weight of them in the darkness, pressing against the edges of my vision, following us through every shadow. We didn't speak, couldn't speak, our lungs burning as we sprinted across the uneven ground, stumbling over roots and stones, trying to put distance between ourselves and whatever had been watching us. When we finally burst through the door of my mate's house, the warmth and light hit me like a wave. The panic was still there, but the physical sense of danger started to fade. I slumped against the wall, shaking uncontrollably, my heart still hammering as I tried to catch my breath. My mates were equally pale, eyes wide, staring at the darkened windows as if expecting it to be outside, waiting for us to slip back into the path. It took a long time before any of us could even speak, each word feeling heavy, clumsy, inadequate. Even then, our minds were spinning, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. Nothing I've read or watched or been told could account for it. There were no rational explanations that made sense. It was not an animal we knew. Not a bear, not a wild boar, not a deer. The size alone, the way it moved, the sheer unnaturalness of those glowing eyes. It defied everything familiar. We stayed inside for hours, locked doors, windows double-checked, lights left on. Every small sound from outside, the rustle of leaves, the tap of rain on the roof, made us jump, tense with fear. Sleep was impossible. Our minds kept replaying the image of that massive black shape, standing there silently, its glowing eyes unblinking, as though it was assessing us, waiting for something. Even in the morning, when the sun had risen and the woods looked entirely ordinary, the terror lingered. The daylight stripped away the fear of the night to some degree, but I still felt an edge of caution, a primal sense of danger, every time I glanced toward the path where it had appeared. We never went back to that section of woods. The path remains the same, quiet, dimly lit, unremarkable in every way, but now it carries a weight for us, a memory that sits heavy in our chests, a warning of how quickly something completely inexplicable can turn ordinary life into panic. Over the weeks that followed, I scoured articles, searched online forums, tried to find anything similar. People spoke of strange sightings in forests, odd nocturnal animals, but nothing matched what we saw. The more I looked, the more I realized that some things in the world are not meant to be understood, only survived. I still think about it. Sometimes when I'm alone walking at night, my steps instinctively quickening near shadows, the hairs on my arms rising without warning. But I also know that we made it out. We ran, we escaped, and that, in itself, is rare. That night in the woods taught me one clear thing. There are things out there that do not fit into the neat, explainable patterns of life. They exist, they watch, and they move through the night. And for that night, at least, we were lucky enough to live to tell the story. We are alive, uninjured, but changed forever. Every step on that path now carries the memory of something impossible, something that can't be rationalized away, and yet it exists in my memory with terrifying clarity, a reminder that reality sometimes contains horrors that are very real, very tangible, and frighteningly close. I remember that trip clearly, even though it happened years ago. My buddy and I decided to go camping on one of my properties in central Pennsylvania. The place is huge, nearly 100 acres of thick, dense woods. You could disappear into it and not see another soul for hours, maybe even days. The closest neighbor is probably 10 miles east, and there's no cell service. I had told my buddy about it, and he was excited to try primitive camping, just a couple of nights out in the middle of nowhere. No trails, no roads, nothing but the forest and the small clearing I had picked for a tent. We figured it would be peaceful, relaxing, a way to disconnect from the city for a bit. We got there late in the afternoon, after a long drive through winding roads and miles of nothing but trees. The sun was already dipping low, casting long shadows that made the woods feel denser than they actually were. We unpacked quickly, set up a small two-person tent in the clearing, and gathered some firewood from the surrounding area. The wood was damp, but we managed to get a fire going, the flames crackling and sending smoke into the cool evening air. The firelight flickered over the trees, making the shadows move in strange ways, but it felt safe enough, at least while the fire was burning. We ate a simple dinner over the flames and then settled down in the tent. My buddy was exhausted from the drive and the work of setting up camp. He fell asleep almost immediately, snoring softly before the darkness had fully taken over. I, on the other hand, couldn't sleep. My mind was too active, too alert. The quiet of the woods was overwhelming, even with the fire still burning a few yards away. Everything felt amplified. The rustling of leaves, the distant sound of a stream somewhere deeper in the forest, the occasional snapping of a twig under the foot of some unseen animal. I tried to lie still, tried to force myself to relax, but the tension in my body just wouldn't let go. Then it happened. The silence of the woods shattered with a scream. It was loud, sharp, and guttural, and it seemed impossibly close. At first, I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I had no idea what it was. It sounded like a woman screaming, high-pitched, and full of panic, right at the edge of the clearing, maybe 20 feet from the tent. My first thought was that someone was hurt, but the idea of another person being in the middle of my property, 10 miles from the nearest neighbor, made no sense. My brain raced through every possibility. Maybe it was some kind of animal, but the sound was so human, so raw, that I couldn't convince myself otherwise. The scream echoed through the trees, bouncing from trunk to trunk, then suddenly stopped. Silence returned, but it felt heavier, oppressive, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. I nudged my buddy, shaking him lightly to try and wake him, but he was completely out cold, oblivious to the terror just outside our tent. My mind refused to calm down. I was on edge, muscles tight, every sense drained. Then I heard it again, a rustling sound, something moving through the underbrush. I tensed completely, waiting. A branch snapped sharply and hit the side of the tent, sending a small puff of dust into the air and rattling the fabric. Something had run past us. I couldn't see it, couldn't even tell how big it was. My eyes darted around the dark forest outside the tent's thin walls, catching shadows but nothing solid. Whatever it was fast and it was close. The rest of the night was a blur of tension and alertness. Every small sound made me flinch. Every brush of leaves outside made me tense like I was about to spring into action. I kept my flashlight nearby, ready to grab it if needed, though I hated the idea of stepping outside into complete darkness. The wind picked up in the early morning hours, rustling through the treetops, adding its own layer of ghostly sound. I eventually drifted in and out of sleep, but it was shallow, full of half-formed images of shadows moving just outside the tent, of glowing eyes in the underbrush. I think I finally fell into a proper sleep, just as dawn was breaking, the light filtering weakly through the dense canopy. When I woke in the morning, everything seemed calm again. My buddy was still asleep, oblivious to the night's terror. I stepped outside, stretching, looking around the clearing. Branches were snapped in a couple of places, and there were signs of movement through the underbrush, trails where small animals had likely passed, perhaps disturbed by something bigger. I inspected the perimeter and realized the noises had likely come from wildlife. Most likely, a bobcat, which I had read, could make noises eerily similar to human screams, especially in the mating season or when startled. The branch that had hit the tent was probably from a deer or another large animal running through the area. Knowing this didn't immediately erase the fear, but it started to make sense. The forest had its own rhythm, its own rules, and I had temporarily forgotten just how unpredictable it could be. That day, we went for a short hike through the property, still cautious but feeling more at ease under the broad daylight. I showed my buddy the areas where animals might travel, pointing out tracks and broken branches, trying to make the experience educational as well as enjoyable. It helped to ground the fear from the night before in something tangible. The forest was still thick and isolated, but in daylight it was easier to comprehend and less intimidating. That night, we made the fire larger and set it closer to the tent, sitting near it long after dark, listening to the woods without fear. The sounds were still there, birds, insects, and the occasional rustle of a deer, but the scream never came again. I finally managed to sleep more soundly, the tension of the previous night slowly easing. We packed up the next morning, leaving the site as we found it, but the memory of that first night stayed with me. I never saw the creature that ran past our tent, never confirmed it was a bobcat, but the experience taught me a lot about the wild, about being alone in the woods, and about respecting the unpredictable nature of isolation. It ended on a calm note. I knew we were safe, that the forest dangers were mostly natural and not supernatural. We left the property, tired but exhilarated, carrying a story that was intense, real, and entirely ours. I never forgot that night, the scream that shredded the quiet, the sudden movement outside the tent, or the feeling of being utterly alone and alert in a forest that could swallow you whole if you weren't careful. It was terrifying, yes, but it was real, and there was a kind of satisfaction in that, knowing we had experienced something raw, untamed, and completely true to the nature around us. I went camping near McLeod, California, down in Squaw Valley, a place I had known most of my life. I had spent years fishing those creeks, driving those dirt roads, parking in spots that never showed up on maps. It always felt quiet out there in a heavy way, like the land was watching, but not in a magical sense, more like the way deep woods make you feel small and exposed. I brought my ex with me because I wanted to share the place. We parked the car in a clearing that sat just off an old service road, surrounded by tall pines and thick brush. The ground was uneven and covered with pine needles that swallowed sound when you walked. Even during the day, it felt cut off from the world. That evening went normal. We cooked, sat around, listened to the wind move through the trees. As the sun dropped, the valley filled with shadow faster than I expected. The temperature fell hard, the kind of cold that creeps in through clothes and settles into your bones. We decided to sleep in the car instead of setting up the tent. It felt safer and easier, and neither of us questioned it at the time. The night itself was quiet, almost too quiet. No wind, no insects, just the occasional creak of trees adjusting in the cold. I remember waking up briefly sometime after midnight and noticing how dark it was. The kind of dark where even the outline of trees disappears. I fell back asleep without thinking much about it. The dream started in a way that didn't feel like a dream. I was inside the car, sitting upright, looking out through the windshield. The sky was pale gray like early morning, that thin light you get right before sunrise. I could see the same trees, the same clearing, everything exactly where it was supposed to be. There was no shift, no blur, nothing that would tell you your mind had made it up. I felt alert and calm, but with a tight focus, like my body knew something was wrong before my brain caught up. That's when I noticed shapes around the car. 8 of them, standing just beyond the reach of the headlights. They were tall, thin, covered head to toe in dark clothing that looked heavy and dull, not fabric you'd see in a store. The hoods covered their faces completely. No eyes, no skin, no features. Just deep black where faces should have been. They weren't moving. They weren't aggressive. They were just there, evenly spaced, forming a loose circle around the car. I didn't feel panic. What I felt was awareness. The kind you get when you realize you're outmatched and should stay still. My heart wasn't racing. My breathing felt slow and shallow. Every sense felt sharpened. I could hear my own blood moving. I could smell cold metal and pine sap. I knew without thinking that these things were paying attention to me. One of them stepped forward. It moved in a smooth, steady way, not rushed, not threatening. It walked to the back of the car. I could feel the weight of it even without seeing details. Then it placed both hands on the rear window. The glass bowed slightly under the pressure. I remember noticing how real that detail felt. The cold from the glass. The faint squeak as skin or gloves pressed against it. The hooded head leaned forward close enough that I expected to see breath fog the window, but it didn't. There was no message spoken. No gesture. Just the feeling that it was looking in, measuring us, deciding something. The others didn't move. They didn't need to. I knew they were watching just as closely. Then I woke up. I sat straight up in the car, heart pounding now, breath sharp. The light was wrong in the exact same way. Pale gray morning. Early. I checked the time. It was a little after 5. Everything in the clearing looked the same as in the dream. Same shadows. Same shapes. The car windows were clear. Nothing was outside. I stayed still for a long time, listening. My ex woke up shortly after, breathing fast, eyes wide. We both just sat there. No talking at first. The tension was thick. Eventually, we started comparing what we had seen, piece by piece, and every detail lined up. The number, the spacing, the way they stood, the one at the rear window, the feeling that came with it, the time of day, even the sense that it wasn't meant to scare us, just to make something clear. Later that morning, once the sun was fully up, we got out of the car. That's when we noticed things we hadn't seen the night before. Footprints in the dirt around the clearing. Not animal tracks. Human boots. Several different tread patterns. Fresh. We followed them for a short distance until they disappeared into thicker brush. Near the edge of the clearing, we found used drug needles tucked under a log. That made my stomach drop. It meant people were coming through there. People who didn't want to be seen. People who moved at night or early morning. The shared dream stopped feeling supernatural and started feeling like something else entirely. Stress. Suggestion. Carbon monoxide from the car. Or maybe something simpler. Maybe we had heard movement in our sleep. Maybe our brains filled in the gaps the same way because we were in the same place, feeling the same unease. The mind is good at building patterns when it thinks you're in danger. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I went back alone during daylight. I noticed how close the clearing was to an old logging route. How easy it would be for someone to watch without being seen. How the terrain funneled sound. How exposed the car really was. I imagined people standing out there in the dark, silent, watching strangers sleep in a place they used regularly. The idea felt more real than anything mystical. The feeling wasn't that we had been threatened. It felt more like a warning. Not from the woods, but from the reality of being somewhere isolated where other people might have reasons to stay hidden. Illegal dumping, drug use, maybe worse. People who don't want witnesses don't need to say anything. Presence alone can be enough. I never camped there again. I still love that area. I still hike nearby trails. I still fish the rivers. But I don't sleep in those forgotten spots anymore. I don't ignore that tight feeling when a place feels watched. Not because of spirits or legends, but because the land can hide people, and people are real, and they are unpredictable. That night taught me something clear and simple. The woods don't need monsters to be dangerous. Sometimes all it takes is silence, isolation, and the wrong sense of safety. The dream wasn't a message from something unknown. It was my brain connecting dots that were already there. And waking up alive, with the daylight coming in, felt less like relief and more like confirmation that leaving was the right decision. I live about a mile from the Manassas National Battlefield Park, a place most people only know in passing or from history books. To be honest, I had never spent much time there myself until recently. It's a huge expanse of rolling fields and patches of forest. There are a few old buildings you can visit, But mostly it's just empty land with trails winding through trees and grass, dotted with markers that tell you which part of the battle happened here. The history is heavy if you think about it, but it's usually quiet, almost too quiet. I used to jog there sometimes, and it always struck me how normal and calm it seemed today compared to what went on there more than a century ago. The sun would shine on the fields, birds would chirp, and you'd hear nothing but the wind rustling through the leaves. It's easy to forget the past when it's so peaceful, until something reminds you it's still there. I have a cat, a stubborn little creature with a coat like smoke, who I walk on a leash and harness. His name is Jasper. He's an odd cat, more dog than cat in some ways. He loves the forest more than anything, chasing leaves and exploring every nook and cranny, sniffing out every hidden path like it's the most important thing in the world. He has an instinct for it, like he knows where he belongs. I usually take him to nearby woods and parks, but until a few weeks ago, we hadn't been to the battlefield itself. For some reason, I had avoided it. Maybe because of the history, or maybe because it felt different, heavier than other parks. But I figured Jasper deserved it. He deserved to explore every place he could, and he trusted me enough to follow me anywhere. We drove there on a late afternoon, the sun low, casting long shadows across the fields. The parking lot had a few people standing in small clusters, talking quietly. Jasper hates crowds and strange people. I could feel him stiffen the moment I opened the car door, ears flat, tail twitching. I picked him up and carried him a little way toward the edge of the forest, just beyond the parking lot, where the trail began. He was alert, whiskers twitching, eyes wide but calm enough in my arms. I lowered him gently onto the dirt trail, and we started walking. Usually, he takes the lead, bounding along, confident and curious, but this time it was different. He froze almost immediately. He sniffed the air, low to the ground, and then raised his head, staring at something ahead. He didn't move for a long moment. I followed his gaze, but there was nothing there, just trees and leaves, the sunlight filtering through. Then he slowly began backing up, ears pinned, tail low, making those tiny hissing noises he does when he's uncomfortable. It wasn't anger or playfulness. It was pure unease. He was trying to wriggle out of his harness, a sure sign he wanted to escape the area entirely. I stopped and crouched, trying to reassure him, thinking maybe a squirrel or some bird had startled him. But it wasn't a small animal. He wouldn't move forward, not even a step. The air felt heavier, too. I could almost feel a pressure in the forest, like the kind you get when a storm is coming, even though the sky was clear. I decided maybe a different trail would work. There's a path along the meadow, more open, with fewer trees, easier for him to feel safe. I lifted him again, and he went completely rigid, ears flat, claws barely retracting, trying to dig into my arms. I walked us to the meadow trail and set him down. He stepped forward a few hesitant paces, head up, eyes darting to me as if asking what I was thinking, then stopped, stiffened again, and bolted straight back to the parking lot. Not the trailhead, the parking lot, racing past the meadow as if the earth itself wanted to swallow him up. I had to chase after him, finally scooping him up before he made a break for the cars in the lot. He was panting slightly, which is rare, ears back, body trembling in my arms. I set him down again, thinking maybe he just didn't like the open space. We tried a smaller side path, less worn, shaded by pines, away from the open fields. Again, he stopped after a few yards, crouched low, ears flat, eyes wide and alert. He was clearly fixated on something I could not see, something that made his fur bristle and his claws dig into the dirt. I scanned the trees, the ground, listening for movement, but there was nothing. No animals, no rustling, nothing. Only the faint sound of wind and the distant hum of traffic miles away. I turned around, intending to take him back to the car, but the way he moved told me he didn't want to just leave the trail. He wanted out of the area entirely. Every muscle in his body screamed it. He was terrified in a way I had never seen him terrified before, and he wasn't afraid of people or dogs or storms. This was something else entirely. I finally realized what it was. Not a ghost, not anything supernatural. That's easy to think when you hear about this place, but it wasn't a ghost. It wasn't the past itself. It was the weight of it, the energy of the land, soaked in a history of violence, pain, and chaos. He could sense it. Animals are more attuned to these things than humans. He could feel the residue of fear, the echoes of a battlefield where thousands of men screamed, fought, and died. The forested areas held the sound, even if we couldn't hear it, and Jasper, being the sensitive creature he is, knew something was wrong. His instincts told him this place could be dangerous, even if there was no immediate threat. I had pushed him too far. Even I felt it now. The air was heavy, almost oppressive, and the trees seemed closer than they should, the shadows longer. My skin crawled. I could feel a slight prickle at the back of my neck. Not fear exactly, just awareness, as if the place was watching us, waiting to see what we would do. We walked back to the car, me carrying him most of the way, him tense in my arms, but gradually relaxing the closer we got. Once we reached the safety of the parking lot, he hopped down, rubbed against my legs, and immediately started cleaning himself, trying to forget what had happened. I opened the car door, and he leapt in without hesitation. He stayed in the back seat, ears twitching, eyes constantly scanning the forest as we drove away. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, watching him settle into the seat, but never fully relax. By the time we got home, the normal hum of my neighborhood felt almost too bright, too warm, like a protective layer we had left behind on that battlefield. He jumped out of the car, stretched, sniffed the air, and wandered off to explore the backyard. For the rest of the day, he refused to go near the front door or look toward the street that led back to the battlefield. Every now and then, I'd catch him sitting in the yard, staring toward the distant tree line with a look I've never seen on him before. Not curiosity, not hunger, but wariness, pure alertness. Like he knew what he had sensed there, and he didn't want to go back. I don't blame him. I've walked that park alone before, and even on sunny days, there's a weight that hangs over the fields and forests. You can almost feel the memories of men running, shouting, falling, leaving their lives behind. It's not a ghost or magic. It's history, brutal and uncompromising, and Jasper sensed it instantly, without needing to understand. Since that day, I haven't taken him back to the battlefield. He still loves the forest, still explores every corner of our neighborhood and nearby parks, but I don't push him toward that place. Some things are too heavy, even for the most adventurous spirits. I think about that day a lot. I think about the way he froze, how his instinct screamed danger even when I saw nothing. I think about the way the forest felt, heavy and still, pressing in without a sound. And I know now that some places are not meant to be tamed or tested. Some places carry memories you can't outrun. And sometimes the smartest thing to do is to turn around, pack up, and let the past remain where it is. Jasper knew that before I did, and I'm grateful he did. We've been back to other forests since, and he's always his fearless, curious self. But the battlefield is off limits, a silent, tense memory we both carry now. Some things are best observed from a distance, and the weight of history is one of them. I don't need to understand it fully to respect it, and I never will push him into that place again. It's a strange feeling walking past that trail in my mind, knowing he knows something I'll never fully grasp. But he's right. The battlefield doesn't belong to us, not really. It belongs to the echoes of what happened there, and sometimes that's enough to know when to leave. I still remember that honeymoon like it happened yesterday, even though it was 21 years ago. We had decided on Swanee State Park in Florida, mostly because it was quiet and, at the very end of the camping season, the sort of place that promised isolation and a break from the noise of the world. At the time, my wife and I were in our early 20s, both of us naive and more eager for adventure than sense. The drive down had been long, the sun already dipping low in the sky when we arrived. I remember the air being thick and humid, the kind of heat that clung to your skin and made your clothes stick. There were barely any cars in the parking lot, and the campground itself seemed deserted, the campsites empty and waiting. The first impression, though, came when we checked in. The guy at the front was a strange one, though outwardly official. He wore the standard ranger uniform, but his eyes lingered on us a bit too long, and there was a stiffness to the way he carried himself that didn't feel right. He asked questions that made my stomach knot. If we had a dog, if we had weapons, if we were planning to protect ourselves in any way. His tone was polite, but there was a weight behind his words, like he was trying to see if we were weak or easy to take advantage of. Then he mentioned casually that they locked the front gate at night. It was normal enough on its face, but in the context of the questions he had asked, it felt like a warning, though of what, I didn't know. We laughed it off, though nervously, and drove toward our campsite, thinking we were just being paranoid. The campground was empty. Not one camper in sight. The gravel paths were deserted, leaves littering the ground, and the wooden posts marking sites stood like silent sentinels. Our campsite was tucked back into a small clearing, surrounded by tall pine trees that swayed and whispered in the wind. We parked the car, and I remember feeling a small thrill of freedom. No one around, just the two of us in the forest. But that thrill was fragile, the kind that disappears the second you notice something off in your peripheral vision. We tried to make dinner, but the wind was relentless. Plates toppled, utensils clattered to the ground, and the fire kept sputtering, refusing to catch. My wife struggled with the matches, her hands shaking more from frustration than cold. I kept glancing at the tree lean, trying to calm the unease settling in my chest. The woods were dark, impossibly dark, and even with our small lantern and headlamps, shadows moved in ways that didn't make sense. Then, out of nowhere, I saw him. At first, I thought it was another camper, maybe someone passing by. But no, it was the ranger. He was standing behind a tree, just far enough that the shadows masked his face, yet close enough that I could see the outline of his figure. He was watching us. I froze, a sudden chill crawling up my spine. My heart pounded in my ears, and I shouted at him, though there was no one else to hear. His response was odd. He didn't run, didn't make an excuse, didn't even acknowledge that he had been caught. He just shifted, tried to walk it off as if he had been taking a casual stroll through the woods. But it was impossible to ignore the intent in the way he moved, the way he lingered near the trees, always keeping his eyes on us. We tried to continue, convincing ourselves it was some weird coincidence, some bizarre misjudgment on our part. But 10 minutes later, there he was again. This time, he was on the opposite side of our campsite, mirrored perfectly to where he had been before, still watching. It was deliberate. He had moved around us without any effort to hide his presence, testing the boundaries of our fear. My stomach dropped, and I realized in that instant that staying there, in that campsite, was dangerous. We weren't just dealing with an overly cautious or quirky ranger. This was a man with a disturbing intent, someone who had made the decision to observe us in a way that felt predatory. The fire still wouldn't catch, the wind beating at our small tent and chairs, and I started tearing things down. We didn't pack slowly or methodically. Everything was hurried, chaotic. Plates and utensils were thrown into the car. The tent was disassembled in record time, and our backpacks were shoved onto the seats. My wife kept an eye on the trees while I worked, both of us moving silently, the panic giving way to a sharp, efficient focus. There was no room for mistakes. Finally, we reached the gate. It was locked, the kind of padlock that felt immovable, the iron cold against my hands. We could hear the wind, the distant rustle of animals, and I could feel the ranger somewhere out there, watching, maybe following. My wife, calm under pressure, reached into the trunk of our car and pulled out the bolt cutters we had stashed months before, just in case of emergencies. I hadn't remembered them, but she had, and at that moment, her foresight was a lifeline. We worked quickly, snapping the padlock and throwing the metal aside, heartbeats loud in the night. We drove out slowly, every creak of the car and crunch of gravel making us flinch. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but empty forest on either side. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see him standing there, waiting to confront us, but the clearing was empty. The park was silent again, eerily so, as if nothing had happened. We didn't speak. There was nothing to say. We just drove, windows rolled up, doors locked, adrenaline pumping so hard it felt like it would burst our chests. By the time we hit the main road, civilization returned slowly. Streetlights, the occasional passing car, The sound of radios and distant voices reminded us that the real world still existed outside the forest. We didn't look back, didn't pause. We kept driving until we reached a small motel in the next town and finally stopped. Only then, in the safety of locked doors and bright lights, did we allow ourselves to breathe. Looking back, it was a combination of fear, quick thinking, and luck that got us out that night. That man was not just a creepy ranger. He was someone who had decided to test our vulnerability, to invade our privacy in a way that could have gone horribly wrong. If it hadn't been for the bolt cutters, if my wife hadn't remembered them, I shudder to think how it could have ended. We never returned to Swanee State Park, never spoke of that night in detail, but it shaped the way we approached wilderness trips from then on. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings, and she became the vigilant one, always prepared for the unexpected. The park, once a place meant for relaxation and adventure, became a reminder that danger isn't always obvious. And sometimes the people who seem official, trustworthy, or in control are the ones you need to be most careful of. That night stayed with us, a lesson carved into memory, a reminder that awareness, preparation, and a calm mind can make the difference between safety and disaster. Even 21 years later, I can still feel that cold iron of the padlock in my hands, the weight of the bolt cutters, the wind biting at us, and the sharp realization that we had just narrowly escaped someone capable of real harm. It was terrifying, it was real, and it ended because we acted decisively and refused to be trapped. Nothing supernatural, nothing fanciful, just two people facing an imminent threat, surviving by sheer will and careful action. And that is exactly what makes it linger in my mind even now. I remember the day clearly, even though it was years ago. I was working a solo shift in the middle of summer at a large national park known for its thick forests, winding rivers, and scattered rocky hills. The park was popular, but at that time it was still early in the season and the trails were quieter than usual. My job as a park ranger meant that I spent most of my time patrolling, checking for hazards, making sure visitors were safe, and maintaining the trails. On this particular day, I had started my morning routine around 6, long before the park opened to the public. The air was still cool, with a faint mist lingering among the trees, and the early sunlight created sharp contrasts of shadow and gold along the paths. The forest was alive with sound, birds calling to one another, insects buzzing, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush as a deer or a fox passed by. I drove my ranger truck along the dirt access roads, keeping an eye out for any hazards. Fallen branches, washed out sections of trail, and slick areas near streams were all things I had to note. My first task was to check on the bridge over the main river. It had been patched recently, but heavy rains from the previous week had caused some erosion along the banks. As I walked the bridge, I noticed that a small section of the railing had loosened. It wasn't immediately dangerous, but if left unrepaired, it could have caused an accident. I jotted it down in my notebook to report later and made a mental note to bring a repair crew the next day. After inspecting the bridge, I decided to check some of the trails leading deeper into the forest. I parked the truck at a small lot and started hiking. The trail was narrow and overgrown in parts, which made the walk slower. I carried my standard gear, a backpack with water, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and a radio for communication. The trail curved along the side of a hill, and as I climbed, I noticed signs of recent human activity, footprints in the soft soil, discarded wrappers, and a faint trail of tire marks. It was unusual because that part of the forest was hard to access without permission, and it suggested someone had been there either illegally or without reporting to the park office. I continued uphill, keeping my senses alert. About halfway up, I heard a sudden crash to my right. At first, I froze, thinking it might be a deer or a fallen branch. But then I realized it was more deliberate. Someone had been chopping wood. The sound came from a small clearing obscured by thick undergrowth. Carefully, I made my way toward the clearing. Peering through the trees, I could see an abandoned campsite. A small fire pit with cold ashes, a few tents collapsed to one side, and several logs cut for firewood. Nothing seemed dangerous at the moment, but it was clear someone had been here recently and had left in a hurry. There were no people around, but the footprints suggested they had gone further into the forest. I took photos for documentation and marked the area on my map. The rest of the day was a mix of walking trails, checking streams for erosion, and noting fallen trees that blocked paths. Around late afternoon, the sun began to dip behind the hills, and the forest took on a warmer tone, with long shadows stretching across the ground. I decided to head back to the truck and make my final inspection of the main roads before leaving. As I walked back, I heard a faint humming sound, like a generator or motor. Following it carefully, I discovered an illegal hunting setup in a more remote part of the park. The hunters had left bait and makeshift blinds, clearly intending to use the area overnight. I documented everything, making sure to photograph and mark the site for enforcement action. By the time I returned to the truck, the sun was almost gone and the forest had started to cool rapidly. The air smelled damp and earthy. I drove slowly along the dirt roads, checking bridges and trail entrances as I went. It was quiet now, the only sounds being the wind through the trees and the occasional distant call of an owl. I stopped at a clearing near a small stream, just to watch the last light of day fade. The water flowed steadily, and I noticed a family of deer cautiously moving along the bank. Moments like that reminded me why I loved this job. The combination of responsibility, solitude, and the simple, unfiltered beauty of the natural world. When I finally returned to the ranger station, I spent time logging my notes, uploading photos, and sending reports. Everything I had seen that day, the bridge, the abandoned campsite, the illegal hunting setup, was carefully recorded so action could be taken. I made sure the park office had the locations for follow-up patrols, and I highlighted areas that needed extra monitoring. After cleaning my gear and double-checking radios and vehicles, I locked up the station and drove home as darkness fully settled in. Looking back, the day was intense but satisfying. I had discovered signs of illegal activity, prevented potential accidents, and experienced the forest in a way few people ever would. There were no spectacular moments, no heroics, no supernatural events, just careful observation, steady work, and a sense of responsibility to the land and its visitors. That day ended clearly because the tasks were completed, the hazards were noted, and the forest remained protected. I felt a quiet pride in the knowledge that my diligence had made the park safer, not just for me, but for everyone who would walk those trails in the days and months to come. The satisfaction of a job done thoroughly, with no shortcuts, made the long day worth it, and I knew that was the real reward of being a park ranger. Keeping the balance between people and nature intact, one careful step at a time. I remember the first time I realized just how unpredictable and raw the life of a park ranger could be. It was a late summer afternoon, the kind of day where the heat still clings stubbornly to the ground even as the sun begins its slow descent. I had been patrolling the eastern boundary of the park, an area that rolled into dense forests with uneven trails and hidden valleys. The ground was dry, and the leaves underfoot crunched sharply with every step I took. My job, most days, was a mix of routine maintenance, monitoring wildlife, and ensuring hikers and campers followed the rules. But that day, the park reminded me just how quickly routine could turn into survival. I started my shift early in the morning, driving slowly along the narrow dirt roads, checking for any signs of illegal hunting or campers who hadn't registered. The early hours were peaceful. The air was crisp, and the occasional rustle of a squirrel or deer in the distance was the only sound. By midday, the temperature climbed into the high 80s, and the smell of dry earth mixed with pine sap hung thick in the air. I parked my truck at a small clearing near a creek to check the water levels and make some notes. The creek had slowed to a trickle compared to the spring melt, and I could see fish darting into shallow pools. After finishing my notes, I decided to hike a section of trail that wound into a steep incline of the forest. I always prefer to check these trails on foot. The vehicle made noise that could scare wildlife, and prevented me from seeing subtle signs of erosion or animal activity. I strapped on my backpack, double-checked my first aid kit, water, and radio, and started up the path. The incline was steeper than I expected, and the air felt heavier with every step. Branches scraped my shoulders, and the occasional insect buzzed in my ear. Around an hour in, I noticed something unusual. Tracks in the dirt, too deep to be deer or dog tracks, but not large enough to be a bear. They were irregular, almost as if someone had been walking quickly through the underbrush and had stumbled in parts. I followed the tracks for a while, curious but cautious. I didn't want to get too deep into an area where cell reception was poor, but my gut told me to see where they led. The trail twisted and narrowed, flanked by steep embankments and thick undergrowth. After another half hour, I reached a small clearing where the tracks disappeared near a fallen tree. That's when I saw it. A backpack, abandoned, lying half hidden in the grass. My stomach tightened. I knew hikers sometimes got lost, and in this part of the park, it could be easy to stray off the trail without noticing. I radioed the ranger station to report the backpack and my location, giving them the details I had. I carefully examined the area. There were signs that someone had been here recently. A few torn pieces of paper, a half-empty water bottle, and footprints leading toward the creek. My instincts told me not to follow alone, but I noticed the water had eroded a narrow path along the bank. I decided to cautiously track it, keeping my hand on the grip of my radio in case I needed immediate help. The sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The sound of the creek became more distinct, a constant gurgle that seemed louder as the forest grew denser. After 20 minutes of careful navigation, I stumbled across a young man, sitting on a rock, clearly exhausted and dehydrated. His clothes were muddy, and he looked relieved when he saw me, though he could barely speak. He had gotten lost while hiking and had been trying to find the main trail for hours. I gave him some water from my pack, checked for injuries, and radioed for backup to bring him safely out. The trail back was slow because I had to guide him carefully over rocks, roots, and uneven ground, making sure he didn't twist an ankle or collapse from exhaustion. By the time we reached the ranger station, the sun had set completely, leaving a deep blue hue in the sky. He was checked over by medical staff, hydrated, and able to call his family. I filed my report and watched as he left with a profound sense of relief, knowing he was safe. That night, after cleaning my equipment and making sure all trails were logged, I walked back along the edge of the park. The forest was quiet except for the soft rustle of nocturnal creatures beginning their nightly routines. I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and satisfaction. Being a park ranger wasn't glamorous. Most days were long, sweaty, and full of little tasks. But days like that reminded me why I did it. The responsibility to protect the land, the wildlife, and the people who came to experience it. By the end of that shift, I knew that the park would continue to be unpredictable. There would be injuries, lost hikers, storms, and even accidents that no training could fully prepare you for. But there was also a clarity in it, a sense that the work mattered. I packed up my things and drove home under a sky full of stars, feeling the quiet satisfaction that came from knowing I had made a difference today. The forest had tested me, and I had met it with vigilance and care. That sense of purpose stayed with me long after the dirt had been washed off my boots. I remember the first time I was truly alone on patrol in the backcountry. It was late spring, the snow had mostly melted, and the forest was a mix of new green leaves and stubborn patches of brown from winter. I had been a park ranger for a few years, mostly doing day shifts and visitor guidance. But this assignment was different. I was assigned a solo night patrol on a remote stretch of trail that wound through thick pine forests and up into ridges overlooking the valley below. It wasn't a heavily trafficked area, and the nearest ranger station was almost 20 miles away by dirt road. The thought of being completely on my own was intimidating, but I had been trained for situations like this, and I knew that being alert and methodical was the only way to stay safe. I started my patrol in the late afternoon, just as the sun began its slow descent. The forest was alive with the sound of birds and the occasional rustle of squirrels in the underbrush. I drove my Ranger truck down the narrow dirt road, watching for any signs of trouble, down trees, blocked trails, or illegal campers. The road was lined with thick forest on either side, and in some places the trees formed a nearly solid wall, blocking the view of anything beyond a few feet. I stopped frequently to check trailheads and clear any debris that might impede hikers. The air was crisp, and the smell of wet earth and pine filled my senses, a comforting reminder that I was in a place that I knew well. By the time I reached the steepest ridge, the sun had almost disappeared behind the distant hills. I parked the truck at a small pullout and began the on-foot portion of my patrol. The trail ahead was narrow, winding, and covered in patches of wet leaves. My flashlight illuminated the path ahead, throwing long shadows against the trees. Each step needed careful placement. The trail was slick and uneven. I had seen hikers twist ankles here in the past, and I didn't want to become one of those statistics. I took out my notepad and recorded the trail conditions, the location of fallen branches, and any wildlife activity I noticed, like fresh deer tracks or the faint smell of a bear. Keeping detailed notes was part of the job, and I took pride in being thorough. About an hour into my hike, I noticed something unusual. The trail veered sharply to the left, but there were no footprints or tire marks suggesting recent use. That wasn't uncommon, but the way the soil had been disturbed looked deliberate. I approached carefully, my hand resting on the grip of my flashlight, which also doubled as a safety tool. When I got closer, I realized that someone had tried to clear a path through a thicket of fallen branches. It wasn't heavy machinery, just human effort. Someone had spent time cutting small branches and moving debris aside. I took photos and marked the GPS coordinates. While it didn't signal immediate danger, it was worth reporting. Illegal trail work could damage the ecosystem, and anyone caught doing could face fines. I continued along the ridge, my senses heightened. The forest seemed quieter now, the usual sounds of birds and insects dimming as dusk turned to night. Every rustle in the underbrush made me pause and listen. A small fox darted across the trail, stopping for a moment to look at me before disappearing into the trees. The encounter reminded me that I wasn't alone, but that the creatures here were usually more wary than dangerous. I checked my watch and noted that it would be completely dark within 30 minutes. When I reached a high clearing, I could see the lights of the distant town twinkling far below. It was a breathtaking view, and I took a few moments to absorb it. But my patrol wasn't finished. On the way back, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. A tree branch had fallen across the trail in such a way that it blocked easy passage. The weight was significant, and it looked like it could have fallen recently. I carefully assessed the situation, deciding the safest way to clear it without risking injury. Using my multi-tool and some rope I carried, I managed to shift the branch enough to create a safe path. It was strenuous work, my hands scratched and dirty, but it was worth it to keep the trail safe for hikers. By the time I returned to my truck, the sky was a deep navy blue, scattered with stars. The night air was cool and still, and the forest had settled into a quiet rhythm. I drove slowly back down the ridge road, my headlights cutting through the darkness. At one point, I saw a pair of glowing eyes reflecting in the beam, probably a deer or a coyote. I slowed and gave it space, letting it cross the road safely. The drive back took longer than I expected because I checked every turnoff, every small path that led to campsites. When I finally returned to the ranger station, I logged everything in detail: trail conditions, wildlife activity, the branch I had cleared, and the signs of human trail modification. I filed the GPS coordinates for follow-up inspection during the day. My body was tired, every muscle aching from the hike and the work on the ridge, but I felt a deep satisfaction. I had kept the forest safe, maintained the trails, and ensured that future visitors could enjoy the wilderness without danger. Patrolling alone in the backcountry isn't glamorous. It's physical work, mental focus, and constant awareness. But it's also rewarding. There's a clarity in the forest at night, a sense of responsibility and accomplishment that comes from knowing you've done your part to protect a place that belongs to everyone. That night, I went to bed sore, tired, and proud, knowing that my watch had kept the park safe and that the forest would be there tomorrow for someone else to explore, just as it had been for generations before me. I remember the morning clearly, the kind of early winter morning that carries a silence, so deep it feels like the whole forest is holding its breath. I had just started my shift as a park ranger in the northern section of the state park, a stretch of land that ran over steep hills, dense conifer forests, and meandering streams. The frost still clung to the branches, sparkling faintly in the weak light, and the ground was hard and uneven underfoot. My first task of the day was a routine inspection of one of the remote trails. It was called the Timberline Loop, a trail that wound up a ridge and then back down, passing by a small creek and an old logging road that hadn't been used in decades. I was alone, as usual in that part of the park at this hour, and I liked it that way. There's a clarity in quiet mornings, a focus that city streets can't provide. I started at the trailhead, checking the map kiosk and the condition of the signage. A few of the signs had frost accumulating on them, making the carved letters hard to read. I snapped a few photos for the maintenance report, noting the small tree that had fallen partially across the path a week before. My boots crunched against the frozen soil as I began the ascent. The air was sharp, filling my lungs and making each step feel deliberate. The forest was alive with subtle noises, the creaking of trees adjusting to the cold, the occasional rustle of a squirrel in the underbrush, the distant call of a hawk circling above. About 30 minutes in, I noticed something odd along the trail. The snow and frost on the ground were light, but there were footprints that didn't match the usual patterns of hikers or deer. They were deep, spaced irregularly, and far too large for a person wearing normal hiking boots. I paused and crouched to examine them. The tracks continued up the slope and then veered off toward the creek. My mind ran through possibilities, maybe a hunter from last weekend or someone cutting through the park instead of following the main trail. But the deeper I looked, the more cautious I became. The prints were fresh, the soil slightly disturbed, indicating they hadn't been there long. I decided to follow the tracks, keeping my eyes on the ground and my ears alert. The trail narrowed, and the trees grew closer together, their low branches brushing against my jacket. My flashlight hung from my belt, though the morning light was enough for now. As I got closer to the creek, I saw something that made me stop entirely. There, half buried in the mud near the edge of the water, was a collapsed tent. Its fabric was torn in several places, and footprints surrounded it in a chaotic pattern. The impression was that whoever had set it up had left in a hurry or had been forced to. I scanned the surrounding area. There was no one in sight. The only sounds were the creek's water moving over rocks and the occasional crack of a tree limb. I took out my radio and reported the situation to the ranger station, giving them precise coordinates and describing what I had found. I had been trained to handle situations like this, searching for lost hikers or campers. But something about the way this scene looked felt different. It wasn't just abandonment. It felt sudden, urgent. While waiting for instructions, I carefully followed the tracks again, leading away from the creek and into thicker woods. The prints zigzagged, moving over roots and fallen logs, showing signs of someone trying to navigate quickly yet awkwardly through the terrain. After about 20 minutes, I came upon a shallow depression in the earth where it seemed the person, or people, had tried to rest. A backpack, wet and muddy, lay partially hidden by ferns. There was a water bottle, half empty, tipped over. By the time the other rangers arrived, I had combed a significant portion of the trail, marking areas that needed to be checked. We spread out, moving methodically, following the tracks until they eventually led to an old, abandoned ranger cabin at the far end of the loop. The cabin was locked, but not completely secured. We could see that someone had been inside recently. The fire pit outside had fresh ash, and there were scraps of food wrappers. The investigation later revealed that a young hiker had gotten lost during a solo camping trip, had attempted to navigate through the ridge, and had ended up using the cabin for shelter. He had tripped and sprained his ankle, which explained the chaotic footprints and abandoned tent. It took several hours, but we were able to guide him safely back to the main trail and then to the park's entrance. He was exhausted, muddy, and hungry, but otherwise unharmed. There was relief, of course, but also a sense of gratitude. Being a park ranger isn't about dramatic rescues every day, but moments like this, finding someone in the woods, following subtle clues, and ensuring they make it out safely, remind me why I love this job. By late afternoon, the forest had returned to its quiet rhythm. I walked back along the timberline loop, inspecting the areas where we had marked hazards, checking the signs again, and noting down what had happened in my log. The sun was low, casting long shadows between the trees, and the frost sparkled like tiny diamonds. Everything was back in order, and the trail was safe for hikers again. I felt the familiar satisfaction of a day's work well done, the quiet hum of the forest around me, and the knowledge that, even in the vast, unpredictable wilderness, small, deliberate actions can make a real difference. By the time I left the park, the woods were golden with sunset light. The hiker was already being cared for by park staff, and the trail would be cleared and repaired over the next few days. I locked the gate behind me, looked up at the ridges I had walked that morning, and felt a sense of calm. The forest was still, the danger had passed, and the day ended with certainty, a clear, tangible conclusion to the morning's tense events. I drove away knowing that tomorrow, the park would continue on as always, but today I had done exactly what a ranger should do. I kept people safe and kept the wilderness as it should be, orderly, alive, and respected. I had been a park ranger for nearly 8 years, patrolling a sprawling state forest that stretched over several dozen square miles. The forest was dense, with towering pines, thick underbrush, and countless small streams that wound their way between the hills. It was beautiful in the spring and summer, when the forest came alive with green and the calls of birds echoed through the valleys. But in the late fall, the place took on a different kind of intensity. The leaves had mostly fallen by then, leaving behind a mix of wet brown foliage and bare branches that snapped underfoot with every step. That morning, I had started my shift just before sunrise. The chill in the air made my breath visible, and the fog that clung to the low valleys gave the forest an eerie stillness, even though I knew it was the perfect time for wildlife to move about. My task that day was routine. I had to check several trails, ensure that signage was in place, inspect the fire pits at the primitive camping areas, and keep an eye out for any illegal activity, such as unlicensed hunting or off-trail motor vehicle use. I began at the main ranger station, loading my truck with supplies, maps, binoculars, first aid kit, and the usual assortment of field tools. I kept my patrol shotgun in the vehicle for safety, though in nearly 8 years, I had never had to use it on anything beyond a startled deer or a bear in the distance. Still, it was a part of the job, a reminder that while the forest was a place of natural beauty, it could also be unpredictable. The first couple of hours were peaceful. I drove down gravel roads that twisted through the hills, stopping occasionally to photograph unusual tracks or mark areas where fallen trees might obstruct a trail. At one of the trailheads, I noticed fresh tire tracks cutting through the mud. They looked recent, likely from an ATV, which was not allowed in this part of the park. I took detailed notes, recorded the time and coordinates, and continued on, knowing I would return later with the game warden to investigate. By mid-morning, I reached a small, isolated campsite that was often used by day hikers. There were no visitors yet, just the remnants of last season's leaves, a few scorched logs in the fire pit, and a light coating of frost on the stones. I inspected the area carefully. Everything seemed in order, until I noticed a backpack tucked under a tree, partially hidden. There was no one around. I approached cautiously, keeping an eye out for wildlife, but all that stirred were a few squirrels and birds. Inside the backpack, I found water bottles, a map, and a small first aid kit, enough to suggest someone had been there recently, maybe lost or trying to hide. I jotted down the details and planned to check with the local ranger station to see if any hikers had filed a missing report. The forest seemed to close in around me as I continued deeper into the trails. I passed by dense clusters of cedar and fir, stepping over roots slick with frost, and heard the occasional snap of a branch under some unseen animal. Around noon, I reached a stream that cut across the trail. The water was low, but clear, and the rocks were slippery with moss. I spent several minutes mapping the area, taking note of erosion patterns and fallen branches that could pose hazards for hikers. While doing this, I spotted tracks along the muddy banks, both human and animal. It looked like a small group had passed through recently, perhaps campers moving toward a hidden clearing I knew about for past patrols. The thought nagged at me, a mixture of concern and curiosity, but I had other areas to check. By mid-afternoon, I was climbing a ridge that offered a view over a wide valley. The sun had begun to dip, casting long shadows that made the forest appear even more vast. I paused at the top, pulling out my binoculars, and scanned for wildlife. A lone deer grazed near a distant pond, and a pair of hawks circled high above. It was moments like these that reminded me why I loved this job. The quiet, the solitude, and the chance to witness nature untouched. I made careful notes, checked my GPS coordinates, and then started the descent down the opposite side of the ridge, toward a trail I had flagged as needing maintenance. As I descended, the forest grew darker and denser. The fallen leaves muffled my footsteps, and the occasional rustle of small animals reminded me that I was never truly alone. At the trail intersection, I began clearing debris with my saw, making sure that fallen branches and rocks were removed. It was tedious work, but necessary. The sun sank lower, and I realized I'd spent far longer on this patrol than I had planned. I made a mental note to start heading back, but I wanted to finish this section first. By the time I reached the final stretch of trail, the forest was fully in shadow. The light filtering through the trees was dim, and the air had a sharp, cold edge. I checked my equipment, made sure my radio was working, and started the hike back to my truck. The trail was slippery, and I had to move slowly. Every step required attention. A few times, I startled deer that bounded away into the brush, and I caught glimpses of raccoons moving along the trail edges. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was really less than an hour, I emerged from the forest onto the gravel road leading back to the ranger station. When I arrived, I recorded all my observations, entered the GPS points into the system, and noted the unusual backpack I had found. I also called the local authorities to report the potential lost hiker. As I finished up, I reflected on the day. Nothing had gone catastrophically wrong, but the forest had reminded me of its power and unpredictability in subtle ways. The unseen presence of animals, the shifting light, the sudden snap of a branch that could make your heart jump. The satisfaction of completing the patrol settled in as I packed away my gear. I had walked many miles, observed wildlife, and ensured the trails were safe for the weekend visitors. Though the forest could be demanding and occasionally dangerous, the clarity of work and the connection to nature made it worthwhile. I drove out of the forest with the sun setting behind me, feeling a quiet sense of accomplishment, knowing I had done everything I could to protect the park and those who would come to enjoy it. The forest was calm now, but it would be alive again tomorrow, and I would be ready. I was stationed as a park ranger in a large national forest that spanned hundreds of square miles of rugged terrain, dense woods, and winding streams. My days were long, and the work could be grueling, but I loved it. The solitude of the forest had a strange way of making time feel slower, almost stretching out each moment, so even mundane tasks could feel significant. My job was a mix of patrolling trails, maintaining park facilities, responding to emergencies, and keeping an eye on wildlife activity. Some days were peaceful, almost boring, but the unpredictability of the forest always kept me alert. One early autumn morning, I set out on a routine patrol through one of the less traveled sections of the forest. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. The leaves had just started to change, so the forest floor was a mix of brown, gold, and orange. I drove slowly along the gravel roads, scanning the edges for signs of human activity or wildlife. Part of my job was to make sure that visitors stayed safe and respected the land. Illegal hunting, littering, and accidents were constant concerns. About an hour into my patrol, I noticed something unusual. A small footpath veered off the main road, barely visible through the overgrowth. It wasn't marked on any of my maps. Curious but cautious, I parked my truck nearby and grabbed my binoculars. From a distance, I saw what looked like a small campsite. There was a fire pit with some charred wood, an old tent partially collapsed, and footprints leading in multiple directions. The area had clearly been used recently, but no one was around. I made a mental note to investigate closer on foot. As I approached, I could hear the faint trickle of a nearby stream. The sound was comforting and helped me focus. I checked the fire pit. The ashes were still warm, meaning someone had been there within the last day. The tent was tattered, likely from wind and rain, but I could see remnants of food wrappers and a few discarded bottles. It wasn't the kind of setup someone would use for a long stay. It seemed temporary, almost like someone had been camping illegally or was passing through. I decided to follow the tracks. The footprints led into a dense part of the forest, where the underbrush was thick and my movement had to be careful. I kept my radio close, alert for any unexpected encounters with either people or wildlife. Bears and mountain lions were a possibility, and even a seemingly quiet forest could be dangerous if I wasn't prepared. After about 20 minutes of careful tracking, the prints split. One set continued along the faint trail, and another veered sharply toward the stream. I followed the trail by the water, which narrowed as it twisted between tall trees and rocks. After another 20 minutes, I stumbled upon something that made me pause. A young deer, clearly injured, laying near the bank. Its leg was trapped under a fallen branch, and it was struggling to move. I immediately assessed the situation. There were no hunters nearby, and it didn't appear to be the result of a trap. Most likely, the branch had fallen during a recent storm. The deer was in pain, and leaving it there would almost certainly mean death. I knew I had to help, even though handling a frightened, injured animal was risky. I moved slowly, speaking softly even though I wasn't sure if the deer could understand me. I found a sturdy stick and carefully lifted the branch enough to free its leg. It flinched but didn't try to run, likely too weak or frightened. Once it was free, I applied a temporary splint with some rope I carried for emergencies and guided it toward a small clearing where it could rest. I stayed with it for nearly an hour, monitoring its breathing and making sure it wasn't bleeding heavily. Once I was confident it could move on its own, I backed away slowly. The deer lingered for a moment, then limped off into the thicker forest. Watching it disappear among the trees, I felt a rare sense of accomplishment. It wasn't dramatic or heroic in a cinematic way, but saving a life in such a raw, real setting was deeply satisfying. On my way back to the main road, I documented everything carefully, where I had found the campsite, the tracks, and the deer's location. Later, I submitted a report to my supervisor, noting that someone had been camping illegally and that an animal had been injured but survived thanks to timely intervention. By the time I returned to my station, the sun was low, casting long shadows across the gravel roads and the forest. I cleaned my gear, checked my truck, and sat for a moment on the tailgate, listening to the sounds of the forest as night began to settle in. It was a long day, but it ended on a good note. I knew the forest was full of challenges, and sometimes those challenges were unpredictable. But the feeling of knowing I had made a small difference, helping an injured animal survive and documenting potential hazards for other visitors, reminded me why I chose this life. Being a park ranger wasn't glamorous. It wasn't about thrilling adventures or dramatic rescues every day. It was about responsibility, observation, and respect for the land and its creatures. And on that day, I had done my job well in the quiet, patient, and sometimes exhausting way that being a ranger demanded. By the end of the week, the campsite had been removed, and park staff had checked the area to ensure no one was in danger. The deer was never seen again, but that was normal. It had its freedom and a chance to survive. For me, the sense of accomplishment lingered. It wasn't a story of heroism for anyone else to tell. It was a story of the forest, of patience, observation, and small but meaningful acts that made a difference. And in the solitude of the woods, that was enough. I had been a park ranger for nearly 7 years, and in that time, I had seen everything from lost hikers to wildfires and the occasional vehicle accident deep in the forest. But one summer morning, I encountered something that reminded me why I loved this job, even when it tested every bit of patience, skill, and common sense I possessed. It started like any other day. I arrived at the ranger station before sunrise, the air still cool with a mist clinging to the trees, and the sky painted in soft shades of pink and orange. My first task was a routine patrol of the east side of the park, a stretch of old-growth forest that climbed steep hills and dipped into valleys where streams ran cold and clear. I drove the park truck slowly along the gravel road, listening to the tires crunch over loose stones. The forest was alive with morning sounds, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the chatter of birds, and the distant hammering of a woodpecker. I checked the usual spots where hikers often got lost, especially near the ridge trail where the incline was steep and the paths forked unpredictably. I always carried a first aid kit, a radio, maps, and a GPS unit, but there's a feeling about the forest you can't capture in any of those tools. It's subtle. The way shadows move, how a bird's call shifts, how distant noises don't line up with what you expect. About 2 hours into my patrol, I noticed tire tracks cutting off the main road and heading down a narrow service path I rarely used. The tracks weren't fresh, but they were recent enough to catch my attention. They were irregular, like someone had struggled with the incline. I decided to follow them on foot. The service path was rough, overgrown with brambles, and littered with fallen branches. As I walked, the smell of damp earth and pine filled the air, and my boots sank slightly into the soft soil with each step. It wasn't long before I came across an old abandoned cabin, mostly hidden by the trees. I had passed it before, but today something was different. The door was slightly ajar, and the ground in front of it showed footprints. I approached cautiously. My eyes scanned for any sign of danger, broken glass, disturbed wildlife, anything unusual. Inside, the cabin was dusty, but I could see that someone had been there recently. There were footprints in the dust, empty water bottles, and a small fire pit outside that still had some charred wood. It was clear someone had spent a night there, likely lost or seeking shelter from storm. The tracks leading further into the woods suggested they had moved on. I marked the area on my GPS and decided to track them, following the footprints as they wove through the forest. Hours passed as I navigated steep hills, crossed shallow streams, and pushed through dense underbrush. By mid-afternoon, I found a person, a middle-aged man sitting on a fallen log near the riverbank, looking exhausted and dehydrated. His clothes were torn from the brush, and he had scratches along his arms. He explained he had been hiking alone, had taken a wrong turn, and spent the night in the cabin after realizing he was lost. I checked him over, made sure he had water, and started guiding him back to the main trail. The journey back was slow and careful. I kept an eye out for hazards, loose rocks along the slope, slippery areas near the river, and unstable logs. I talked him through each obstacle, making sure he stayed calm. By the time we reached the park road, the sun was low in the sky, and the forest had shifted from golden light to the long shadows of evening. I radioed back to the ranger station, confirming that both of us were safe and would return shortly. When we arrived at the station, I helped him into a chair and offered him food and more water. He was tired but grateful, and I could tell he had learned a hard lesson about venturing into the wilderness unprepared. I filled out the report, noting the exact location, his condition, and the trail he had taken. The sense of relief was palpable, not just for him, but for me. As a ranger, it's moments like this that make all the long hours, rough terrain, and occasional dangers worth it. After he left, I stayed at the station a while longer, organizing equipment and checking maps. The forest was quiet now, the sounds of the day replaced by a gentle evening breeze. I looked out at the trees, feeling the weight of the day settle on my shoulders, and reminded myself why I chose this job. It wasn't about fame or excitement. It was about the small victories, the lives protected, the trails kept safe, and the quiet knowledge that the forest was still a place where people could explore, learn, and respect nature, even when mistakes were made. By the time I locked up the station and climbed into my truck for the drive home, the stars were starting to peek through the dark sky. I turned the key, listening to the engine hum, and felt a rare kind of satisfaction. The forest had tested me today, as it always would, but we had made it through together. There was no drama, no miracles, just preparation, vigilance, and persistence. And in the quiet of that long summer evening, that was more than enough. I remember that day like it was yesterday, even though it happened several years ago. I had been a park ranger for just over 4 years at that point, and while I'd seen plenty of odd and uncomfortable situations, nothing had felt quite like what unfolded that morning. The park I worked in was one of the larger ones in the state, with rolling hills, dense forests, and stretches of wetlands that could swallow a careless hiker whole. It was early spring, and the snow had just started to melt, leaving the ground soggy and slippery in places. The sun had barely started its climb, filtering weakly through the remaining patches of frost and thin fog hovering above the lowlands. My morning patrol began like any other. I started by checking the usual spots: the visitor center, the trailheads, and the small parking lots scattered throughout the park. The dirt roads were still wet from overnight frost, and my truck tires squelched against the thawing ground as I made my rounds. There was a certain quiet that comes with early mornings in a park like this. The sound of my engine was swallowed almost immediately by the trees, and the only other noise was the occasional drip of melting snow from branches. It was the kind of peace that could make you forget the dangers hiding in plain sight. By mid-morning, I had moved deeper into the forest, driving slowly along the narrow service roads. My main objective for the day was to check the condition of the trails that led up to a popular lookout point. Spring was always rough on the trails. Melting snow caused erosion, and fallen branches and debris made the paths treacherous. I stopped at one of the smaller creek crossings to inspect the bridge. It was an old wooden structure, but sturdy enough. Water ran swiftly underneath, carrying chunks of ice and broken twigs downstream. I walked across it, testing each board carefully. As I reached the center, I noticed something unusual: a series of footprints in the muddy banks on the far side of the creek. They weren't deer or bear prints. They were clearly human. What caught my attention, though, was that they looked fresh, like someone had walked there very recently. I squinted into the shadowed underbrush beyond the creek and saw no one. I made a mental note to report it and continued up the trail. The forest here was thick, with tall oaks and pines creating a patchy canopy. The sun barely reached the forest floor, leaving the ground damp and littered with leaves, pine needles, and twigs. As I hiked the last stretch toward the lookout, I noticed more signs of human presence: discarded wrappers, a half-empty water bottle, and what appeared to be a makeshift camp of sorts. It was crude, but clearly meant for temporary use. The site was tucked into a small clearing, invisible from the main trail unless you were looking closely. I paused and took notes, thinking about who might have been camping here. The park had rules against unauthorized camping, but during spring, hikers and hunters sometimes ignored them. I spent the next hour inspecting the lookout trail, clearing minor debris, and taking photographs of areas that had been eroded. The sun had risen higher by then, warming the air and casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across the forest floor. The wind had picked up slightly, rustling the trees and carrying the scent of wet earth and pine sap. It was a beautiful day in the woods, deceptively calm. That was when I heard it, a low, persistent noise coming from deeper in the forest. At first, I thought it might be the wind, but the sound had a rhythm, a movement that was distinctly not natural. It was faint but unmistakable, a snapping of branches and something heavy moving through the underbrush. I froze and listened carefully, my eyes scanning the dense growth. Whoever, or whatever, was there, they were moving deliberately, not like a deer or any normal wildlife. My instincts as a ranger kicked in. I quietly reached for my radio to call for backup, but the signal was patchy here. I knew the closest ranger station was several miles away. I couldn't rely on immediate help. So I started walking slowly in the direction of the sound, keeping the trees between me and the movement. My boots sank slightly in the wet soil, leaving prints of my own as I advanced. The noise didn't stop. In fact, it seemed to grow louder, closer. I kept a mental note of landmarks, small bends in the trail, and large rocks, in case I had to backtrack quickly. After what felt like an eternity, I came upon a small clearing where the movement had originated. There was no one there. Instead, I found more evidence: an abandoned backpack, some torn clothing, and a few cans of food scattered around. It looked like someone had been there in a hurry and left in even more of a rush. The ground bore footprints leading away into a thick patch of underbrush, almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. I followed them cautiously, keeping my senses alert for anything out of place. After a short distance, the trail vanished into dense vegetation, and the footprints abruptly stopped. Whoever had vanished. I scanned the area and saw signs of scrambling. A small slope leading into a creek bed where the mud was churned as if someone had slid down quickly. I reported the findings immediately via my radio when I got to a spot with better reception. The dispatcher informed me that a search team would be sent to investigate, but they would take time to arrive due to the remoteness of the location. I decided to stay nearby, keeping watch over the area to ensure no one returned or fell into trouble. Hours passed slowly. Birds moved through the trees, and the wind carried the smell of wet leaves and moss. I checked the area carefully, noting everything and making sure nothing was disturbed further. By late afternoon, the search team arrived. They examined the area, collected evidence, and scoured the surroundings. After hours of careful searching, they confirmed there was no immediate danger, no one injured or lost, and that the person who had been there had likely left on foot or by another exit point I had noticed. We secured the area and documented everything for the park records. It wasn't the kind of incident that would make the news, but for a ranger, it was a reminder of the unpredictability of the job and the responsibility we held for both visitors and the wilderness itself. As I drove back to the ranger station at sunset, the sky painted with orange and pink streaks behind the trees, I reflected on the day. It had been tense, uncertain, and a little unnerving, but it ended safely. No one had been harmed, the park remained protected, and I had done my job by keeping watch and documenting everything thoroughly. That night, I made a full report detailing every observation, every footprint, every snapped branch and piece of abandoned gear. It was meticulous work, but necessary. By the time I finished, the sun had set completely, leaving only the glow of the station lights. I sat back in my chair, tired but satisfied, knowing that even though the forest could be unpredictable, careful attention and diligence kept both the park and its visitors safe. The feeling of calm that night was earned. It wasn't magical or supernatural, just the quiet reward of knowing I had done everything I could to protect the land I cared for deeply. I remember that day like it was yesterday, even though it happened several years ago. I had been a park ranger for just over 4 years at that point, and while I'd seen plenty of odd and uncomfortable situations, nothing had felt quite like what unfolded that morning. The park I worked in was one of the larger ones in the state, with rolling hills, dense forests, and stretches of wetlands that could swallow a careless hiker whole. It was early spring, and the snow had just started to melt, leaving the ground soggy and slippery in places. The sun had barely started its climb, filtering weakly through the remaining patches of frost and thin fog hovering above the lowlands. My morning patrol began like any other. I started by checking the usual spots: the visitor center, the trailheads, and the small parking lots scattered throughout the park. The dirt roads were still wet from overnight frost, and my truck tires squelched against the thawing ground as I made my rounds. There was a certain quiet that comes with early mornings in a park like this. The sound of my engine was swallowed almost immediately by the trees, and the only other noise was the occasional drip of melting snow from branches. It was the kind of peace that could make you forget the dangers hiding in plain sight. By mid-morning, I had moved deeper into the forest, driving slowly along the narrow service roads. My main objective for the day was to check the condition of the trails that led up to a popular lookout point. Spring was always rough on the trails. Melting snow caused erosion, and fallen branches and debris made the paths treacherous. I stopped at one of the smaller creek crossings to inspect the bridge. It was an old wooden structure, but sturdy enough. Water ran swiftly underneath, carrying chunks of ice and broken twigs downstream. I walked across it, testing each board carefully. As I reached the center, I noticed something unusual, a series of footprints in the muddy banks on the far side of the creek. They weren't deer or bear prints. They were clearly human. What caught my attention, though, was that they looked fresh, like someone had walked there very recently. I squinted into the shadowed underbrush beyond the creek and saw no one. I made a mental note to report it and continued up the trail. The forest here was thick, with tall oaks and pines creating a patchy canopy. The sun barely reached the forest floor, leaving the ground damp and littered with leaves, pine needles, and twigs. As I hiked the last stretch toward the lookout, I noticed more signs of human presence. Discarded wrappers, a half-empty water bottle, and what appeared to be a makeshift camp of sorts. It was crude, but clearly meant for temporary use. The site was tucked into a small clearing, invisible from the main trail unless you were looking closely. I paused and took notes, thinking about who might have been camping here. The park had rules against unauthorized camping, but during spring, hikers and hunters sometimes ignored them. I spent the next hour inspecting the lookout trail, clearing minor debris, and taking photographs of areas that had been eroded. The sun had risen higher by then, warming the air and casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across the forest floor. The wind had picked up slightly, rustling the trees and carrying the scent of wet earth and pine sap. It was a beautiful day in the woods, deceptively calm. That was when I heard it, a low, persistent noise coming from deeper in the forest. At first, I thought it might be the wind, but the sound had a rhythm, a movement that was distinctly not natural. It was faint, but unmistakable, a snapping of branches and something heavy moving through the underbrush. I froze and listened carefully, my eyes scanning the dense growth. Whoever or whatever was there, they were moving deliberately, not like a deer or any normal wildlife. My instincts as a ranger kicked in. I quietly reached for my radio to call for backup, but the signal was patchy here. I knew the closest ranger station was several miles away. I couldn't rely on immediate help, so I started walking slowly in the direction of the sound, keeping the trees between me and the movement. My boots sank slightly in the wet soil, leaving prints of my own as I advanced. The noise didn't stop. In fact, it seemed to grow louder, closer. I kept a mental note of landmarks, small bends in the trail, and large rocks, in case I had to backtrack quickly. After what felt like an eternity, I came upon a small clearing where the movement had originated. There was no one there. Instead, I found more evidence: an abandoned backpack, some torn clothing, and a few cans of food scattered around. It looked like someone had been there in a hurry and left in even more of a rush. The ground bore footprints leading away into a thick patch of underbrush, almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. I followed them cautiously, keeping my senses alert for anything out of place. After a short distance, the trail vanished into dense vegetation, and the footprints abruptly stopped. Whoever it was had vanished. I scanned the area and saw signs of scrambling. A small slope leading into a creek bed where the mud was churned as if someone had slid down quickly. I reported the findings immediately via my radio when I got to a spot with better reception. The dispatcher informed me that a search team would be sent to investigate, but they would take time to arrive due to the remoteness of the location. I decided to stay nearby, keeping watch over the area to ensure no one returned or fell into trouble. Hours passed slowly. Birds moved through the trees, and the wind carried the smell of wet leaves and moss. I checked the area carefully, noting everything and making sure nothing was disturbed further. By late afternoon, the search team arrived. They examined the area, collected evidence, and scoured the surroundings. After hours of careful searching, they confirmed there was no immediate danger, no one injured or lost, and that the person who had been there had likely left on foot or by another exit point I hadn't noticed. We secured the area and documented everything for the park records. It wasn't the kind of incident that would make the news, but for a ranger, it was a reminder of the unpredictability of the job and the responsibility we held for both visitors and the wilderness itself. As I drove back to the ranger station at sunset, the sky painted with orange and pink streaks behind the trees, I reflected on the day. It had been tense, uncertain, and a little unnerving, but it ended safely. No one had been harmed. The park remained protected, and I had done my job by keeping watch and documenting everything thoroughly. That night, I made a full report detailing every observation, every footprint, every snapped branch and piece of abandoned gear. It was meticulous work, but necessary. By the time I finished, the sun had set completely, leaving only the glow of the station lights. I sat back in my chair, tired but satisfied, knowing that even though the forest could be unpredictable, careful attention and diligence kept both the park and its visitors safe. The feeling of calm that night was earned. It wasn't magical or supernatural, just the quiet reward of knowing I had done everything I could to protect the land I cared for deeply. I spent the first hour of my morning walking along the narrow dirt road that cut through the edge of the park, the sun barely cresting the distant hills, painting the sky in muted shades of orange and pink. The air was crisp and carried the faint scent of pine mixed with damp earth from last night's rain. My boots sank slightly into the soft, wet soil with each step, and I could hear the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. The park was quiet, almost deceptively so, the kind of silence that made every sound, the distant call of a crow, the snap of a twig under my own foot, seem louder. I carried my usual gear, a radio, a flashlight strapped to my belt, and a small first aid kit, though I hoped I wouldn't need it today. Being a park ranger was a job that demanded constant vigilance, and even though I'd walked these trails 100 times before, I never assumed I knew them perfectly. By mid-morning, I had made it to a section of the park known for its rocky outcrops and steep inclines. This area wasn't heavily trafficked by visitors, mostly because the climb was tiring and the paths weren't marked, as well as the easier trails near the entrance. I liked these areas. They felt untouched, raw, and it was in these parts that the park's character really showed. I kept an eye out for any signs of erosion or fallen trees, noting them in my small notebook. The rocks here were slick from the rain, and I had to watch my footing carefully, especially on the steeper slopes. One misstep here could lead to a serious injury. The forest was alive with activity, a deer darting through the trees, birds hopping along branches, squirrels chasing one another up and down trunks. As I continued my patrol, I noticed something unusual near a small stream that ran through a narrow valley. The water was shallow, but clear, and it had carved a small trench in the soft soil over time. Along the bank, there were several sets of footprints that didn't belong to any animal I recognized. They were human, and from the size and spacing, I could tell they belonged to at least 2 people. I crouched down to examine them more closely, my boots pressing into the soft mud, leaving my own prints alongside. The tracks seemed fresh, perhaps from the night before or early this morning. My mind immediately went through a list of possibilities: hikers, campers, or someone venturing off the trail. I made a mental note to check the park's records for any permits issued for overnight stays in this area. I followed the footprints carefully, moving through thick brush and around fallen logs. The forest here was dense, and sunlight barely filtered through the canopy. My breathing became more deliberate. Each step required focus. After a few hundred meters, the tracks led to a clearing that I hadn't noticed before. It was a small meadow surrounded by tall trees, and in the center, there was a makeshift campsite. A few logs had been arranged around a small fire pit, which still had faint traces of ash. Someone had clearly been here recently, but there was no one in sight. I scanned the area thoroughly, looking for any signs of distress or litter. There were a few scraps of food packaging and a backpack left by the fire, but nothing alarming. Still, it was unusual to find this so far off the main trails, especially with the park having strict regulations about camping outside designated areas. I took photographs of the campsite and the track for documentation and radioed the park office to report the situation. While I waited for a response, I inspected the surrounding area, checking for hazards, broken branches, unstable rocks, and signs of wildlife activity. The meadow sloped gently toward the stream, and the soil was damp from overnight condensation. Tiny insects crawled over the moss-covered rocks, and I noticed mushrooms sprouting in shaded patches. There was a beauty here untouched by heavy foot traffic, a reminder of why this park had been preserved in the first place. By early afternoon, the park office confirmed that no permits had been issued for camping in that part of the forest. They requested that I monitor the area and ensure that any visitors were guided back to approved sites if found. I stayed for several more hours, walking the perimeter of the meadow and the surrounding trails. It was peaceful in its own way, but there was an edge to it, a reminder that the forest could be unpredictable. A sudden rustle in the trees made me tense, but it turned out to be nothing more than a raccoon, pausing to peer at me from a low branch before disappearing into the undergrowth. As evening approached, I made my way back down the trail toward the main park road. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky streaked with shades of purple and gray. Shadows stretched long across the forest floor, and the air had grown cooler. I double-checked my notes and photographs, making sure all evidence of the unauthorized campsite was logged. Back at the ranger station, I filed a detailed report and updated the logbook. Later, the maintenance crew would remove the campsite remnants, and park rangers would place signage to discourage future off-trail camping. The day had been long, but satisfying. The forest was alive with its own rhythms, and I had witnessed it in ways that few visitors ever would. Even when things seemed quiet or mundane, there was always something to discover, a detail to note, or responsibility to uphold. Being a park ranger meant accepting the unexpected, taking care of the land, and ensuring the safety of both the park and its visitors. I closed the station door behind me as darkness settled in, the scent of pine and damp earth lingering in my clothes. I knew tomorrow would bring another trail, another set of eyes scanning the forest, another chance to protect and observe. It wasn't glamorous and it wasn't easy, but it was real, it was important, and it was mine. I remember the morning clearly, the kind of early winter morning that carries a silence, so deep it feels like the whole forest is holding its breath. I had just started my shift as a park ranger in the northern section of the state park, a stretch of land that ran over steep hills, dense conifer forests, and meandering streams. The frost still clung to the branches, sparkling faintly in the weak light, and the ground was hard and uneven underfoot. My first task of the day was a routine inspection of one of the remote trails. It was called the Timberline Loop, a trail that wound up a ridge and then back down, passing by a small creek and an old logging road that hadn't been used in decades. I was alone, as usual in that part of the park at this hour, and I liked it that way. There's a clarity in quiet mornings, a focus that city streets can't provide. I started at the trailhead, checking the map kiosk and the condition of the signage. A few of the signs had frost accumulating on them, making the carved letters hard to read. I snapped a few photos for the maintenance report, noting the small tree that had fallen partially across the path the week before. My boots crunched against the frozen soil as I began the ascent. The air was sharp, filling my lungs and making each step feel deliberate. The forest was alive with subtle noises, the creaking of trees adjusting to the cold, the occasional rustle of a squirrel in the underbrush, the distant call of a hawk circling above. About 30 minutes in, I noticed something odd along the trail. The snow and frost on the ground were light, but there were footprints that didn't match the usual patterns of hikers or deer. They were deep, spaced irregularly, and far too large for a person wearing normal hiking boots. I paused and crouched to examine them. The tracks continued up the slope and then veered off toward the creek. My mind ran through possibilities. Maybe a hunter from last weekend, or someone cutting through the park instead of following the main trail. But the deeper I looked, the more cautious I became. The prints were fresh, the soil slightly disturbed, indicating they hadn't been there long. I decided to follow the tracks, keeping my eyes on the ground and my ears alert. The trail narrowed, and the trees grew closer together, their low branches brushing against my jacket. My flashlight hung from my belt, though the morning light was enough for now. As I got closer to the creek, I saw something that made me stop entirely. There, half buried in the mud near the edge of the water, was a collapsed tent. Its fabric was torn in several places, and footprints surrounded it in a chaotic pattern. The impression was that whoever had set it up had left in a hurry or had been forced to. I scanned the surrounding area. There was no one in sight. The only sounds were the creek's water moving over rocks and the occasional crack of a tree limb. I took out my radio and reported the situation to the ranger station, giving them precise coordinates and describing what I had found. I had been trained to handle situations like this, searching for lost hikers or campers, but something about the way this scene looked felt different. It wasn't just abandonment. It felt sudden, urgent. While waiting for instructions, I carefully followed the tracks again, leading away from the creek and into thicker woods. The prints zigzagged, moving over roots and fallen logs, showing signs of someone trying to navigate quickly yet awkwardly through the terrain. After about 20 minutes, I came upon a shallow depression in the earth where it seemed the person or people had tried to rest. A backpack, wet and muddy, lay partially hidden by ferns. There was a water bottle, half empty, tipped over. By the time the other rangers arrived, I had combed a significant portion of the trail, marking areas that needed to be checked. We spread out, moving methodically, following the tracks until they eventually led to an old, abandoned ranger cabin at the far end of the loop. The cabin was locked, but not completely secured. We could see that someone had been inside recently. The fire pit outside had fresh ash, and there were scraps of food wrappers. The investigation later revealed that a young hiker had gotten lost during a solo camping trip, had attempted to navigate through the ridge, and had ended up using the cabin for shelter. He had tripped and sprained his ankle, which explained the chaotic footprints and abandoned tent. It took several hours, but we were able to guide him safely back to the main trail and then to the park's entrance. He was exhausted, muddy, and hungry, but otherwise unharmed. There was relief, of course, but also a sense of gratitude. Being a park ranger isn't about dramatic rescues every day, but moments like this, finding someone in the woods, following subtle clues, and ensuring they make it out safely, remind me why I love this job. By late afternoon, the forest had returned to its quiet rhythm. I walked back along the timberline loop, inspecting the areas where we had marked hazards, checking the signs again, and noting down what had happened in my log. The sun was low, casting long shadows between the trees, and the frost sparkled like tiny diamonds. Everything was back in order, and the trail was safe for hikers again. I felt the familiar satisfaction of a day's work well done, the quiet hum of the forest around me, and the knowledge that even in the vast, unpredictable wilderness, small, deliberate actions can make a real difference. By the time I left the park, the woods were golden with sunset light. The hiker was already being cared for by park staff, and the trail would be cleared and repaired over the next few days. I locked the gate behind me, looked up at the ridges I had walked that morning, and felt a sense of calm. The forest was still, the danger had passed, and the day ended with certainty, a clear, tangible conclusion to the morning's tense events. I drove away knowing that tomorrow, the park would continue on as always, but today I had done exactly what a ranger should do. I kept people safe and kept the wilderness as it should be, orderly, alive, and respected. I was on my usual patrol in the northern section of the park, the area where the trails twisted through dense stands of pines and the land rose into small ridges. The morning air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of damp soil and fallen needles. The sun had just crept over the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched across the forest floor. I had started early, not because I had any special reason, but because the park was quieter in the early hours, and it gave me a chance to notice small details that often went unnoticed once the crowds arrived. The first part of my patrol took me along the old logging trail, a dirt road that had been used decades ago, but had since become overgrown with ferns and young saplings. My truck moved slowly over the uneven ground, tires crunching on loose gravel and dry leaves. Occasionally, I'd see tracks of deer, raccoons, or even a bear that had wandered close to the trail. I made mental notes of these signs, marking them in my notebook later because patterns of wildlife movement were important for managing the park's balance. As I continued along the trail, I came across a small stream that cut through a low valley. The water was clear, moving over smooth rocks with a quiet, steady murmur. I parked my truck near the bank to inspect the area more closely. The stream had flooded slightly after the recent rains, leaving dark, muddy marks along the edges. I noticed a few young trout struggling in the shallow waters, their silver bodies glinting in the sunlight. I spent some time examining the bank for erosion and damage, taking photographs for my report. It was part of my job to monitor these small details, because even minor changes in a stream's flow could indicate larger environmental issues. After spending an hour near the stream, I resumed my patrol. The trail began to climb gradually, winding through denser forest. The sound of the wind through the pines was almost constant now, a low whistle that seemed to follow me along the ridge. I checked my radio periodically, making routine contact with the main ranger station. Everything was quiet, normal, but the silence had its own weight, a kind of tension that always seemed to hang in remote areas. About midday, I reached a clearing that overlooked the park's main valley. From this vantage point, I could see miles of rolling forest, the green of the trees broken only by patches of brown from exposed soil or fallen leaves. I stepped out of my truck and stretched, taking in the view. The valley below was dotted with wildlife. A few deer grazing near the edge of a meadow, a red fox darting between trees, and birds flitting from branch to branch. I made notes of the species I could identify, planning to cross-reference them with previous reports. It was then that I noticed something unusual. On the far side of the meadow, there was a cluster of discarded items partially hidden among the tall grass. At first, I thought it might be a camper who had left some trash, but as I got closer, I saw more. There were several broken crates, empty cans, and even a rusted barrel. The area looked like it had been used recently, perhaps as a makeshift campsite or a spot for illegal dumping. I carefully documented everything, taking photographs and marking the GPS coordinates. The afternoon passed slowly as I continued my patrol. I followed side trails, checking for signs of trespassers, and kept an eye on the wildlife. The forest was alive with small sounds, the chirp of birds, the rustle of squirrels, the occasional snapping of a branch underfoot. I noted subtle changes in the vegetation, such as young trees struggling to grow in areas where the soil was compacted or exposed. These were all details that could affect the long-term health of the park. By late afternoon, I reached the edge of the park near a logging road that had been closed off to the public. I parked my truck and walked a short distance along the boundary fence, inspecting it for damage. Some of the posts were leaning, likely from weather and time, but nothing major. I made notes for repairs and marked areas where we might need to add new fencing to prevent wildlife from wandering onto the road. As the sun began to set, the forest changed again. Shadows lengthened and the temperature dropped noticeably. I started heading back to the ranger station, taking the long route through the main trail, so I could monitor another stretch of forest for any unusual activity. On the way, I saw a pair of deer crossing a small creek, their movements careful and deliberate. I watched them for a few moments, appreciating the simple, natural rhythm of the forest. By the time I returned to the station, the sky was a deep orange, fading into purple. I parked my truck, unloaded my gear, and reviewed my notes and photographs. Everything I had seen that day was cataloged for the reports I would submit tomorrow. There was nothing extraordinary, no emergencies, just the work of maintaining the park, observing its wildlife, and ensuring the land remained safe and healthy for both animals and visitors. The satisfaction I felt at the end of the day wasn't dramatic or thrilling. It was the quiet kind that comes from knowing you had done your job well. The forest would continue on its own rhythm, but my small role in watching over it, documenting changes, and protecting its resources mattered. I cleaned my equipment, checked my truck, and prepared for the next day's patrol, knowing that each day brought small discoveries and responsibilities. The work was demanding and sometimes lonely, but it was meaningful, grounded in reality, and finished with the clear knowledge that I had contributed to something larger than myself. The day ended calmly, with no emergencies, no chaos, just the steady rhythm of the park, the satisfaction of a job done thoroughly, and the knowledge that tomorrow would bring another chance to walk the trails, observe the wildlife, and keep the forest safe. It was the kind of ending that left me tired but content, grounded in the reality of the work I had chosen. I remember the day like it was yesterday, even though it happened years ago. It was early autumn, that time of year when the air is crisp in the mornings and the fog hangs low over the valleys, leaving the trees dripping with moisture. I was on a solo patrol in the northern section of the park, a rugged area that few visitors ever reached. The roads were narrow, barely more than dirt tracks, winding through dense forest and along steep cliffs that overlooked the river below. I had my standard gear: the Ranger truck, first aid kit, walkie-talkie, GPS, binoculars, and a notebook for logging any observations. The sky was clear, and the sunlight was breaking through the trees in scattered golden patches, illuminating the forest floor in a warm glow that made the fallen leaves shine like fire. I started my day with a routine inspection of the trailheads. There were several popular hiking trails in that section, but I was more concerned about the less traveled paths, the ones where people sometimes ventured too far and got lost. As I drove down one of these narrow paths, the truck bouncing over rocks and ruts, I noticed something unusual near a creek crossing. The water was higher than usual, and debris from a recent storm had washed downstream, piling up against the small wooden bridge. I stepped out to inspect it. The bridge looked unstable. Some of the planks were cracked, and a large branch was lodged under the support beams. I made a note in my journal and marked it as a hazard to be repaired, knowing I would have to report it to the maintenance team. After checking the bridge, I continued further into the forest. The trail narrowed, and the trees grew closer together. The sunlight was dimmer here, filtered through layers of leaves. I stopped occasionally to observe wildlife. A family of deer grazed in a small clearing, cautious but not alarmed by my presence. Birds flitted from branch to branch, their calls echoing in the quiet of the forest. I was always mindful to move slowly, leaving no sudden movements that could startle the animals or disrupt their habitat. Part of being a park ranger is learning to blend into the environment, to become a silent observer rather than an intruder. Hours passed as I patrolled deeper into the backcountry. The trail eventually led to a ridge overlooking a steep canyon. From there, I could see the river winding far below, the water sparkling in the sunlight. The area was remote, and cell service was unreliable, which meant I had to rely entirely on my training and equipment. I checked the map, noted my location, and continued on foot to explore a side trail that followed the ridge. The forest here was denser, and the undergrowth was thick with ferns and moss. My boots sank into soft patches of decaying leaves, and the smell of wet earth was strong in the cool air. As I walked, I came across signs of human activity. A campsite had been abandoned not long ago. I saw a fire pit with ashes still warm, a few empty food containers, and a torn tent that had collapsed in the wind. I took photos and documented the scene, noting that the area needed a cleanup. But more importantly, I checked for any hazards or evidence that someone might have been in trouble. Everything appeared in order, so I left a marker on my GPS to report it to the park office later. By mid-afternoon, clouds started to gather, darkening the sky. I decided it was time to head back toward the main trail. On the way, I encountered a steep slope covered in loose gravel. I moved cautiously, testing each step before shifting my weight. One misstep could have sent me tumbling down to the rocks below. At the base of the slope, I found a small stream, partially blocked by fallen branches. The water was clear, running over smooth stones, and I stopped to refill my water bottle. I took a moment to enjoy the quiet, the only sound being the gentle rush of water and the distant call of a hawk. As I began to hike back to the truck, the rain started lightly, then grew steadier. I pulled on my rain jacket and adjusted my backpack. The forest floor became slippery, and the path I had taken earlier felt treacherous under the sudden downpour. I moved deliberately, making sure each step was secure. My training kicked in, slow, steady, always aware of footing and surroundings. By the time I reached the truck, I was soaked but safe. I checked my GPS one last time to confirm my position and started the engine. Driving back toward the park office, I noticed how the rain had transformed the forest. The leaves glistened, the river swelled, and small waterfalls had formed along the hillsides. It was a reminder of how powerful and unpredictable nature could be. By the time I reached the office, the rain had stopped, leaving behind a cool, clean scent that filled the air. I logged all my observations in detail, including the unstable bridge, the abandoned campsite, and the weather changes. Each note would be used to improve the safety and management of the park. That day reminded me why I became a park ranger. It wasn't about heroics or danger, though those moments exist. It was about vigilance, attention to detail, and respect for the land. I spent the rest of the afternoon coordinating with the maintenance team to repair the bridge and arranging a cleanup of the campsite. By evening, everything was in order, and the forest had returned to its quiet, natural rhythm. Walking through the park, observing the wildlife, and ensuring the safety of visitors. It was a long day, physically tiring but mentally fulfilling. I left knowing the forest was protected, the trails were safer, and the natural beauty of the park would remain intact for those who came after me. It was a simple, honest accomplishment, and that clarity, that feeling of purpose, was the best part of the job. I remember the morning clearly. The sky was still a pale gray, the sun barely peeking over the distant ridges when I started my shift at the park. It was early spring, and the air carried that crisp, biting quality that made every breath feel sharp and alive. The trails were quiet, almost unnervingly so, except for the occasional rustle of early birds moving through the bare branches. My truck rattled along the gravel road as I made my rounds, the tires crunching over loose stones, and I could see frost clinging stubbornly to the patches of grass that hadn't yet felt the warmth of the sun. I parked near the lower trailhead, where the forest opened into a wide meadow. The grass was dotted with the last remnants of winter frost, and a thin mist hung just above the ground, curling around the trunks of the trees like faint smoke. My first task was to inspect a section of trail that had been damaged during a late-season storm a few weeks earlier. Fallen branches and dislodged rocks had made parts of it unsafe, and I needed to make sure the route was passable for hikers and bikers who would be coming in the next few days. I walked slowly along the trail, stepping over tangled roots and loose stones, keeping my eyes on the path and the ground beside it. The forest was alive in its quiet way. Squirrels darted between trees, birds called in short, sharp bursts, and somewhere off in the distance, a deer moved gracefully through the underbrush. It was peaceful, but the kind of quiet that makes you notice every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves. About halfway through the trail, I spotted the first major problem. A large pine had fallen across the path, its roots torn violently from the earth. The trunk was heavy, and even leaning against it, I could feel the weight pressing into the ground. I took out my chainsaw and got to work slicing through the tree methodically. The smell of fresh cut would fill the air, sharp and resinous, mingling with the earthy scent of wet soil. It took some time, but eventually I had cleared the path enough to be safe for anyone walking through. I stacked the branches neatly to the side, leaving the larger trunk sections for removal later. After finishing that section, I I moved further up the trail, making notes on a small clipboard I carried. I checked water crossings, making sure the small wooden bridges were intact. One of them had a loose plank, so I tightened the nails and tested it before moving on. The attention to these small details was essential. One misstep by a hiker, and it could have led to serious injury. Every time I fixed something, I felt a quiet sense of accomplishment, knowing that the work I did mattered, even if no one saw it immediately. As the morning stretched into early afternoon, the sun had climbed higher, burning away the mist and warming the forest floor. I moved toward the ridge trail, a narrow path that wound up steeply through a section of old-growth forest. The air was heavy with the scent of damp pine and soil. Here, erosion had taken its toll over the winter, washing away parts of the trail and leaving deep grooves where water had run freely. I marked the worst spots, noting where logs and rocks would need to be placed to stabilize the path. I spent a long time examining the slope, testing the soil with my boots, making careful measurements in my head about where materials could be sourced and how they could be positioned to prevent future damage. Mid-afternoon brought a change in the weather. Clouds gathered quickly, and a stiff wind began to whip through the trees, rattling branches and sending leaves skittering across the ground. I could feel the pressure drop, the smell of rain on the wind, and I knew it was going to come down hard. I packed up my equipment and started the hike back toward the vehicle, choosing a route that allowed me to check a few smaller trails on the way. By the time I reached the truck, the first drops had started to fall, lightly at first, then heavier, pounding on the roof with a steady rhythm. I sat inside for a moment, watching the storm sweep across the forest, listening to the rain hit the trees, feeling the damp chill through the closed windows. I knew the park would be quiet for the rest of the day. Most hikers and visitors would avoid coming out in weather like this, which meant I had some time to drive the perimeter and make sure gates were secure, signs were visible, and no unexpected hazards had appeared. As I made my rounds, I noticed the small details, the way the wind bent the tops of trees, the way fallen branches littered the edges of trails, the glint of water in small puddles forming in depressions. Every observation mattered. By late evening, the storm had passed, leaving behind a soaked but calm forest. The air smelled fresh, earthy, and clean. I finished my patrol at the ranger station, logging all my notes and securing equipment. Walking through the quiet station, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The trails were safe, the park was ready for visitors again, and I had done everything I could to keep it that way. The work was exhausting, sometimes frustrating, but it was also grounding. It reminded me why I became a park ranger, to care for a place that was bigger than me, to preserve it and make it safe for everyone who came after. As I left the station and drove home, the forest behind me glimmered under the last light of day. I knew that tomorrow there would be new challenges, new sections of trail to repair, new observations to make. But there was also a quiet reassurance in knowing that the work mattered. The forest was resilient, and with attention and care, it would remain that way, welcoming all who came to walk its paths, breathe its air, and feel its calm. It was a good day, a long day, but a day that ended with the forest safe and thriving exactly as it should be.